there's an awesome article on the Mary Sue, everybody's favorite angry feminist website, where they're like, the Princess Bride's problematic because it's full of fucking icky white people. And I'm sitting there going, I mean, that's just the tone that these assholes always take. Ew, white people. And so they're like, well, if you're going to remake The Princess Bride, it's a good time to make sure you put all the black people in it. So we're just going to remake a movie just so we can not put white people in it. You don't see that that's fucking racist?
Não, é porque somos nós que tentamos o mundo inteiro.
Minecraft is better. Minecraft is better, but I respect the shit out of Pac-Man. I've never played Fortnite. I liked Fortnite a lot better when it was called Unreal Tournament. It's funny. Mrs. Salty even smirked at that one. She went, I love how in The Princess Bride you'll have a Spaniard, a Frenchman, an Englishman, an American, and they go, there's no diversity. No diversity. Assholes. Not all white people are the same. My grandma's German. My grandma was German, and my grandfather was Portuguese and English. They're not the same. Hans Crutchfeld, then they complain that white people don't like it. That in England.
Let me ask the question detectives ask, Huey Bono, who profits from this as far as Democratic presidential candidates go? At first, I thought it would have been Joe Biden because now he's elevated. He's the villain, the hero that the villain is opposing and elevating in this matter. But you know what? The more I read about this, no, I don't think he was doing something terrible in Ukraine, but it's just so, why can't politicians tell their fucking kids, get a job?
It's too swampy.
Get a goddamn job. I mean, this kid was paid $600,000 because his name is Biden by a gas company in Ukraine, this super corrupt country that just had a revolution to get rid of corruption. It just looks bad. And the Republicans are geniuses at muddying the water. Just to know, it's all going to be about, you did this in Ukraine, well, Joe Biden did this. It does sound like some
Microcurrent technology had no experience whatsoever with utilities or with natural gas or the like. And he just happens to have made over $600,000 sitting on the board of this company that was being investigated for rampant corruption. So Trump turns around and demands that this prosecutor who was investigating his son's role in the illegal activities of this Ukrainian company that he was getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in from, for no demonstrable reason or expertise, Trump demands that this prosecutor get fired, and he threatens to withhold $1 billion in financial aid until the Ukrainian government fulfills such a demand. So what do you think, upon discovering this, what do you think Rachel Maddow would do with this information? Well, she would do precisely what Mar said she would do. She would be pounding it 24/7 and demanding Trump's resignation and impeachment and all-out prosecution. But now replace the characters in that scenario with Joe Biden and his son Hunter, who was discharged from the Navy because he was caught snorting cocaine. He has no experience in utilities or anything of merit whatsoever to be on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company that we now know was attempting to buy the then Vice President Biden. So those are now the new characters in this scenario. And what does Rachel Maddow do? Nothing. Not a peep. You hear the bird chirps? For months, Maddow reported on the Russian collusion hoax. For months, she promised her viewers that Robert Mueller was going to finally bring President Trump down. For months, she made up one fake news story after another, and now that you have actual, real, full evidence of a sitting vice president openly boasting that he threatened to withhold $1 billion in financial aid to Ukraine unless they fired the prosecutor that was investigating his son's role in a corrupt natural gas company. No. This is the epitome of fake news. And even ultra-liberal leftists like Bill Maher are openly calling it out. Now, the key to understand what's going on in all of this, okay, what we need to keep in mind in terms of the big picture, why the neo-Marxist media and the Democrats are teaming up with this impeachment push, all the while actively attempting to ignore the rampant corruption behind Joe Biden and his son. I think a number of pundits are right on this. What they're saying is that the Democrats and the deep state media have yet to forgive the American people for what they did in 2016. And here's what we have to understand when it comes to 2016. What happened when we voted for Donald Trump? For the first time in recent memory, the people, the populace, voted for someone that the vast majority of the Washington establishment in both political parties was against. I'm going to say that again because I think it's absolutely key to try to understand what's unfolding here. And we'll get into this. In 2016, the American people voted for someone that the vast majority of the Washington, D.C. establishment in both political parties was against. The British political scholar Matthew Goodwin says a similar thing about Brexit. Brexit was always destined to bring Britain into a full-blown crisis. And that's because the vote to leave was the first moment in Britain's national history when the majority of people outside of Parliament asked for something that a majority of people inside Parliament did not want to give. Brexit was always destined to bring Britain into a full-blown crisis because the vote to leave was the first moment in Britain's national history when a majority of people outside of Parliament asked for something that a majority of people inside Parliament did not want to give. So I can't think of a better description of November of 2016. I mean, remember, both Brexit and the election of Trump were back-to-back events, right? Brexit took place in June of 2016, Trump in November. And so I think this observation is key to understanding what is going on here with the impeachment hysteria. The election of Donald Trump was always destined to bring our nation into a state of absolute crisis because it was the first time in recent memory when the American people voted for someone that the vast majority of the Washington swamp in both political parties, Republicans as well as Democrats, did not want in office. So in many respects, this impeachment crisis was inevitable. And now the question is whether the Republican Party has been transformed enough into Trump's nationalist populist image to defend and fight for their president. And again, to answer that, I think all we have to do is look across the pond to see what's happening in Britain. You've had a number of Tories, the Conservative Party, right? A number of Tories defect over to the leftist side of the aisle, 21 to be exact, over the whole issue of Brexit. These are the swampy establishment remainers who claim to be conservatives. Election happens before coming in at
Temos Serviço Nacional de Saúde que é exemplar a nível internacional. Os sucessivos governos têm-no deteriorado propositadamente a fim de o entregar aos privados. A saúde é um bem cada vez mais escasso à maioria dos portugueses. O público e o privado podem coexistir, não podem prejudicar-se um ao outro.
Represento e voto no PNR porque é o único projeto que me garante o presente e o futuro dos meus netos.
Eu amo Portugal, que é o meu país. Voto PNR por um futuro feliz.
Por Portugal, pelos portugueses, pela mudança, eu voto PNR.
Eu quero uma política completamente diferente para o meu país. Por isso, voto PNR.
Pela defesa da nossa identidade, temos que mudar estas políticas de imigração. Não aceitamos que a substituição demográfica seja feita com migrantes. É necessário, sim, reverter estes fluxos migratórios. É necessário dizer não à vinda de mais refugiados para esta Europa e para Portugal. No dia 6 de outubro, vote no Partido Nacional Renovador. A corrupção é crime de traição à pátria. Traição essa que condiciona a vida de uma nação, dos portugueses e cria desigualdade entre os mesmos. Com o PNR, os corruptos serão julgados, condenados, os seus bens confiscados e proibidos de voltarem a exercer cargos públicos.
Desde a sua gênese, o PNR se define como um partido pró-vida e pró-família. Entendemos que a família é a célula base da sociedade. É nela que se transmitem os valores. Por isso o PNR defende a família e defende a vida contra toda a espécie de ataques que hoje em dia se verificam. Barrigas de aluguer, aborto, eutanásia, o chamado casamento entre pessoas do mesmo sexo e por aí fora. Votar no PNR no dia 6 de outubro é ter a certeza que vota num partido que defenderá com unhas e dentes estes valores intemporais, estes valores de uma sociedade normal.
No dia 6 de outubro, vote PNR, Partido Nacional Renovador.
PNR, Partido Nacional Renovador.
Temos um Serviço Nacional de Saúde que é exemplar a nível internacional. Os sucessivos governos têm-no deteriorado propositadamente a fim de o entregar aos privados. A saúde é um bem cada vez mais escasso à maioria dos portugueses. O público e o privado podem coexistir, não podem prejudicar-se um ao outro.
Represento e voto no PNR porque é o único projeto que me garante o presente e o futuro dos meus netos.
Eu amo Portugal, que é o meu país. Voto PNR por um futuro feliz.
Por Portugal, pelos portugueses, pela mudança, eu voto PNR.
Eu quero uma política completamente diferente para o meu país. Por isso, voto PNR.
Pela defesa da nossa identidade, temos que mudar estas políticas de imigração. Não aceitamos que a substituição demográfica seja feita com migrantes. É necessário, sim, reverter estes fluxos migratórios. É necessário dizer não à vinda de mais refugiados para esta Europa e para Portugal. No dia 6 de outubro, vote no Partido Nacional Renovador. A corrupção é crime de traição à pátria. Traição essa que condiciona a vida de uma nação, dos portugueses e cria desigualdade entre os mesmos. Com o PNR, os corruptos serão julgados, condenados, os seus bens confiscados e proibidos de voltarem a exercer cargos públicos.
Desde a sua gênese, o PNR se define como um partido pró-vida e pró-família. Entendemos que a família é a célula base da sociedade. É nela que se transmitem os valores. Por isso o PNR defende a família e defende a vida contra toda a espécie de ataques que hoje em dia se verificam. Barrigas de aluguer, aborto, eutanásia, o chamado casamento entre pessoas do mesmo sexo e por aí fora. Votar no PNR no dia 6 de outubro é ter a certeza que vota num partido que defenderá com unhas e dentes estes valores intemporais, estes valores de uma sociedade normal.
No dia 6 de outubro, vote PNR, Partido Nacional Renovador.
PNR, Partido Nacional Renovador.
Temos um Serviço Nacional de Saúde que é exemplar a nível internacional. Os sucessivos governos têm-no deteriorado propositadamente a fim de o entregar aos privados. A saúde é um bem cada vez mais escasso à maioria dos portugueses. O público e o privado podem coexistir, não podem prejudicar-se um ao outro.
Represento e voto no PNR porque é o único projeto que me garante o presente e o futuro dos meus netos.
Eu amo Portugal, que é o meu país, voto PNR por um futuro feliz.
Por Portugal, pelos portugueses, pela mudança, eu voto PNR.
Eu quero uma política completamente diferente para o meu país. Por isso, voto PNR.
Pela defesa da nossa identidade, temos que mudar estas políticas de imigração. Não aceitamos que a substituição demográfica seja feita com migrantes. É necessário, sim, reverter estes fluxos migratórios. É necessário dizer não à vinda de mais refugiados para esta Europa e para Portugal. No dia 6 de outubro, vote no Partido Nacional Renovador. A corrupção é crime de traição à pátria. Traição essa que condiciona a vida de uma nação, dos portugueses e cria desigualdade entre os mesmos. Com o PNR, os corruptos serão julgados, condenados, os seus bens confiscados e proibidos de voltarem a exercer cargos públicos.
Desde a sua gênese, o PNR se define como um partido pró-vida e pró-família. Entendemos que a família é a célula base da sociedade. É nela que se transmitem os valores. Por isso o PNR defende a família e defende a vida contra toda a espécie de ataques que hoje em dia se verificam. Barrigas de aluguer, aborto, eutanásia, o chamado casamento entre pessoas do mesmo sexo e por aí fora. Votar no PNR no dia 6 de outubro é ter a certeza que vota num partido que defenderá com unhas e dentes estes valores intemporais, estes valores de uma sociedade normal.
No dia 6 de outubro, vote PNR, Partido Nacional Renovador.
Greta Thunberg, she's that 16-year-old Swedish girl who looks more like 12 years old. She's mentally ill, according to her mother and according to herself. She's being depressed, she's being suicidal. She has other medical problems. Here, listen to her say it.
So when I was 11, I became ill. I fell into depression. I stopped talking and I stopped eating. In 2 months, I lost about 10 kilos of weight. Later on, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, OCD, and selective mutism.
Huh. Well, she arrived in America to spread terror and depression, actually. Here she is at the United Nations. Now, look at this girl. She is still mentally ill. She is being used and abused in part for her mental illness. Take a look at this.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Yeah, get that girl to the Kids Help Phone or something. Get Child and Family Services. That is a girl who was suicidal, who lost 1/4 of her body weight. She is still not right, and her parents have weaponized her. They're abusers. Now, by the way, she looks about 12, doesn't she? She's not. She's a mentally ill 16-year-old. I'm not picking on her. I'm not the one pushing her into a media hurricane for my own ends. She's a puppet of lobbyists and extremists and of her crazy, crazy mother.
Nu ska jag ner och handla lite mat. Det är inget konstigt alls. Nej, nej, nej. Och det är inte en massa assistenter och sådant som folk kanske tror. Nej, nej, bara jag och mina dansare. Jag handlar precis som vanligt folk gör. Tacos och pizza. Och jag har ingen rysk kaviar här, inte som folk kanske tror. Nej, nej, nej. Inget konstigt alls.
Yeah, that's Greta Thunberg's mom. She's like those beauty pageant moms in the U.S., obsessed with turning their daughters into Miss America for their own emotional and financial reasons? Yeah, I blame her mom, actually. So Greta, the mentally disturbed teen, was the big sensation at the UN, at least for the globalist crowd, the crowd that believes in global government, global taxes. They love environmental extremism and emotion. It's jet fuel for them. But Donald Trump, he's pretty much the opposite of those ideas, isn't he? One of my favorite things is reading old Donald Trump tweets mocking global warming as a scam. This one here isn't even that old. He mocks the financial aspect, mocks the carbon credits. He calls it a scam. What a laugh. And I just love this video. So young Greta, with her faces being stunned into silence just by Donald Trump walking into the room. Did you see this?
Welcome to the UN, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's the difference between real life and a child actor, I think. But here's my point. We all heard about Greta. For God's sake, she was compared to saints, to Joan of Arc. Let me show you just one example. This is from Sarah Silverman. You think you will recognize Jesus when he comes back? I see him all around. He is this girl. And y'all don't even see it. That's Sarah Silverman talking about Greta. I don't think Sarah Silverman, a hardcore left-wing atheist Jew, knows a lot about Jesus, actually. She just is emotionally reacting to a disabled girl being weaponized. It's quite pitiful. That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show, which is a show I do every day. I do a monologue, interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. But you've got to subscribe to it, which you can do at premium.rebelnews.com.
Watching some journalists from IGN and reading the comments section is absolutely hilarious. It's like someone asked, like, how do these people have jobs? And someone else responded, it's like, who they know and who they blow. And I'm like, holy shit, that's a little bit too misogynistic for my taste. But usually the truth hurts. It is difficult to understand how they have a job, considering that they write about controversies. Like, none of the stuff that they write happens to be what gamers are actually concerned about. Because maybe it's just me, maybe like all the gamers that I hang around with on Discord, on different forums, in online games themselves, just don't seem to be concerned about any of these issues that these people make a fuss about. A gamer is concerned about bugs. A gamer is concerned about loot boxes. A gamer is concerned about the gameplay and the quality. And for some reason, like, none of these things are important for these people. They are going to constantly talk about Borderlands 3 and about what an amazing game it is, while completely ignoring the bugs, the crashes, like all of the things that piss off the actual gamers. And not to mention, like, gamers were pissed off when Borderlands 3, the company, decided to stream at E3 and release some of the names of the people that were involved with the development. So people just wrote down the names and then went on Twitch. And when those names were streaming the game before release, a YouTuber decided to do some journalistic investigation and actually showed some screenshots from the thumbnails, from, like, being publicly available. It's not people's fault that they're so stupid that they're not careful with their secretive data. And that YouTuber, which loved the game and had an entire channel dedicated to Borderlands 3, was hit by copyright strike after copyright strike until they turned off his channel. They sent private detective to his house. What the that is a controversy that gamers are really pissed off about, but journalists were doing damage control for that person. Just so you can understand. When I think of video game journalists, I don't think of the gateway between the consumer and the publisher. No, journalists are just shills. They are part of the marketing team for the developers nowadays. And often they will start controversies about things that will take away from the conversation about, actual issues. For example, oh, you want to talk about Call of Duty? Well, tell me about the microtransactions, tell me about the stability, the lag, that's things that gamers care about. But instead we talk about white phosphorus in a video game. Fucking video game. Why not talk about the Dark Elves in Warhammer 40K that like to torture babies because they scream louder and they suffer more, and they feed on the suffering in order to renew their souls? I mean, if you have a problem with white phosphorus, do you have a problem with that? If you have a problem with what about Diablo? Mythical creatures that steal the human souls. What about using nukes in video games? What about using communists in video games? Where do we draw the line? Okay, gamers, aka normal people, like to look at a game, and if they don't enjoy the game, they don't buy it. If it ruins their sensitivities, they don't buy it. We're talking about Battlefield, a game that's about war. It's about killing people, and now it's let's not use white phosphorus in a video game. It's not white phosphorus. It's pixels on a screen, you moron. It's fictional, right? If these people really are abhorred by this, why aren't they abhorred by rap music? If you're saying that fictional violence causes real violence or something, I genuinely don't even give a shit about what their argument is at this point. But if you're so offended about fictional stuff, why aren't you offended about gangsta rap music? Where you pop a cap in So you got this journalist. Don't care about her. Please don't contact her. She's not important. When you talk about the journalist, you talk about all of them. All right, they're like stormtroopers. All of them look the same. All of them fire the same shit, and all of them miss. I believe we need to keep examining violence in video games, not through the lens of censorship, but through the lens of context. That's why pieces like John's are important. So there's this circle jerk where they promote each other, nothing never before seen. But I love it when Donald Trump talks about video game violence and how it needs to be censored. They're screeching. It's like, the Republicans, video game violence. And then when that controversy dies down, they start to talk about why video games need to be censored. And it's we need to have the conversation. No, you need to fuck off. There is no conversation to be had. All right? It's called artistic freedom. The developer can do whatever he wants, and if it offends you, good. This is how I purchase my game developers. If any developer watches, if your game offends the check marks on Twitter, I will buy it, even if I don't like it. All right? You can sell me some grand strategy LGBT type of game that only LGBT people like. I will buy it. I will buy it if it pisses off the correct people. The journalist can sell your game. Listen to me. If it pisses them off, I will buy 2 copies. I will buy 2.
Há um leite que faz bem a todos. Faz bem à lavoura, à natureza.
2 copies. It's literally at this point. This is how much I dislike these people and their profession and everything they stand for. I don't care when Donald Trump.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I'm 16 years old. I come from Sweden, and I want you to panic. We live in a strange world where the United Science tells us that we are.
United Science?
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. One of the core beliefs of climate alarmists is that the oceans are becoming acidic as a result of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They call this ocean acidification. The point being to create primal fear that you're going to be boiled alive by acid. Let's read the description in Wikipedia. Ocean acidification is the ongoing decrease in the pH of the Earth's oceans, caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Seawater is slightly basic, meaning pH greater than 7, and ocean acidification involves a shift towards pH neutral conditions rather than a transition to acidic conditions. An estimated 30 to 40% of the carbon dioxide from human activity released into the atmosphere dissolves into oceans, rivers, and lakes. To achieve chemical equilibrium, some of it reacts with the water to form carbonic acid. Some of the resulting carbonic acid molecules dissociate into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, thus increasing ocean acidity. Between 1751 and 1996, surface ocean pH is estimated to have decreased from approximately 8.25 to 8.14, representing an increase of almost 30% in H+ ion concentration in the world's oceans. Earth system models project that by around 2008, ocean acidity exceeded historical analogs, and in combination with other ocean biogeochemical changes, could undermine the functioning of marine ecosystems and disrupt the provision of many goods and services associated with the ocean beginning as early as 2100. Note that I highlighted the words estimated, models project, and could undermine. As with almost everything else climate alarmists believe in, their belief system about ocean acidification is based on models. Now let's take a look at the real world. My undergraduate degree is in geology from Arizona State University, and then I went into the master's program in geochemistry at the University of New Mexico. This picture of the university was taken a little before my time. I'm not quite that old. I didn't finish up my master's program in geochemistry at the university and instead went off to be a wilderness ranger in the nearby Sandia Mountains. That was great fun, and then I spent the next 2 years working as a wilderness ranger, running movie theaters, and working as a school teacher. But I did learn quite a bit of geochemistry during my time at the University of New Mexico. Let's look at the Wikipedia claim again. Surface ocean pH is estimated to have decreased from 8.25 to 8.14. Now let's look at some actual measured ocean pH data from Monterey Bay. As you can see, ocean pH varies a lot from week to week. During the time they were taking the measurements in Monterey Bay, it varied from about 7.7 up to 8.1. Now let's look at the claim Wikipedia is making about the change since the 18th century. I superimposed it here as the pink bar. As you can see, week-to-week changes are larger than the claimed change since the 18th century. Nobody really knows what the average pH of the ocean is now, much less back in the 18th century. But the claimed change since the 18th century is much less than the week-to-week noise. This gives us a very strong hint that the whole thing is just more model-based nonsense. Carbon dioxide levels on Earth for most of the last 600 million years were much higher than they are now. Corals and shellfish evolved during the Cambrian era when CO2 levels were nearly 20 times as high as they are now. If we look over here on this geological time chart, it says Cambrian era, abundant life in the seas. If ocean acidification was a real problem, there wouldn't have been any life in the seas, much less abundant life in the seas. As a geologist, I rely on actual historical data, not fake computer models. Let's take a look at Science News for Students. Animals, Fossils, Evolution, When Life Exploded. Scientists probe what happened 540 million years ago to trigger the biggest emergence ever of animal species. Now let's look at what CO2 levels were right at the time when the biggest explosion of life occurred. Well, look at that. The biggest explosion of life occurred right when CO2 levels were at their peak for the last 600 million years. This tells us that carbon dioxide is tremendously beneficial for life. As is normally the case, climate alarmists have no idea what they're talking about, and they have everything exactly backwards. They rely on computer models rather than history. Computer models can generate any result you want and generally just reflect the inherent biases of the person who wrote the software. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiments, it's wrong." Now let's look at what's wrong with the models. If climate alarmists were geologists instead of just theoreticians, they would have known that the oceans are underlain by basalt. Basalt is an alkali rock which comes out of volcanoes and buffers the pH of the ocean. Because the oceans are underlain by alkali rock, the pH range of the ocean is very limited. You could dump a lot of acid into the ocean, and it would react with the basaltic rock at the bottom and get neutralized. The pH of the ocean is primarily controlled by the underlying rock, not the atmospheric CO2 content. Thus, we were able to have an explosion of life at 7,000 parts per million CO2. If the pH was controlled by atmospheric CO2, these huge swings would have been catastrophic. So we've pretty much covered the science. Now let's look at some of these psychological aspects of this. Last year I went snorkeling in Acamal, Mexico with a very progressive friend. The part of the coral reef we went snorkeling at was dead. She was convinced that it was because of coral bleaching and ocean acidification. I did some research online and found that other people had taken very nice pictures of the coral reef at Acapulco, so apparently we were just at a bad spot. I know that the reef was damaged heavily by Hurricane Wilma in 2005. And later in the week, we went snorkeling at Cozumel, about 10 miles away. Cozumel is the second largest reef system in the world after the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. The reef at Cozumel has recovered very nicely from Hurricane Wilma. So it's fascinating that ocean acidification decided to target the reef at Acapulco, but leave the reef at Cozumel alone. Global warming is just so fickle. I've talked to people at the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder who've said, well, even if we're wrong about climate, we're still doing the right thing because of ocean acidification. One layer of nonsense being justified by another. The climate alarmist clown show never seems to end. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg cried before the UN a couple days ago and said her childhood was stolen. Instead of attending school, she traveled to the UN in a multi-million-dollar yacht. And Greta is being considered for the Nobel Prize. Greta believes that her childhood was stolen because people have told her that sometime in the distant future, very bad things are going to happen because people are not using solar cells. This makes her the first person to have her childhood stolen by computer models. She believes that the only way to prevent this apocalypse is for everybody to put solar panels on their roof, like these ones in Sydney, Australia, which were destroyed by hail. Let's look now at some of the environmental and human benefits of solar panels. While the actual generation of electricity from photovoltaics produces no greenhouse gas emissions, the life cycle carbon costs of photovoltaic panels amounts to between 0.07 and 0.18 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Production and installation of photovoltaics also require far greater amounts of tin, silver, aluminum, zinc, and copper than any other conventional source of energy. While a portion of these metals are sourced through recycling programs, a large majority come from mining ventures that carry with them large environmental footprint. These mining ventures include environmental impacts such as acid mine drainage, large-scale arsenic emissions, cyanide and mercury poisoning of waterways, and consumption of as much as 10% of the world's energy usage, not to mention the widespread human rights abuses and child labor exploitation in mineral-rich regions of the developing world like Chile and Bolivia. Well, that sounds genuinely filthy and disgusting. A few years ago, experts determined that they could replace the iodine in solar cells with cobalt and thus make it more sustainable. These children in the Congo, like Greta, also don't attend school. They're mining cobalt for Greta's solar panels, helping to keep her childhood from getting stolen. No doubt these child slaves would support her Nobel Prize bid. Unlike President Trump in the United States, Germany is listening to Greta Thunberg. They are shutting down their coal-fired power plants and replacing them with natural gas plants and purchasing the gas from Russia. They say this is necessary because solar power and wind energy are unreliable. The Bloomberg headline tried to make it sound like Merkel's bad behavior was somehow Trump's fault. So in order to help Bloomberg out, I fixed the headline for them. This one is more accurate. Merkel switching from German fossil fuels to Russian ones. Another possibility is Putin primary beneficiary of the global warming scam. A third possibility is green energy powered by child labor. I would suggest to Greta that she enjoy her charmed childhood and the beautiful weather outside, and stop listening to unscrupulous adults who are frightening her in order to push a political agenda. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. We don't have a climate crisis. What we have is a crisis of people saying things that aren't true about the climate and which they don't believe in. About a century ago, the great American philosopher H.L. Mencken said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." One of the favorite hobgoblins of climate alarmists is sea level rise, invoking primal fear of drowning. The Sydney Morning Herald is running this hysterical story today. Hotter oceans, wilder weather, less ice. The IPCC upgrades projections to catastrophic. A new IPCC report says inaction on climate change will likely result in sea level rise of 1.1 meters by 2100. Without action, the seas will be 5 meters higher by 2300. And then at the bottom they say, the report warns that warming oceans and melting sea ice glaciers will raise sea levels by 30 to 60 centimeters by the year 2100. So they've already contradicted themselves. Up here they say sea level is going to rise 1.1 meters by 2100, and down at the bottom they say 30 to 60 centimeters. That's a huge difference, nearly a factor of 2 to 4. And there's no such thing as a sea ice glacier. Sea ice is ice which forms in the sea, and glacial ice is ice which forms on land. The authors of this article have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. If the Sydney Morning Herald authors actually did any research, they would know that what they're saying was complete nonsense. This is a graph of sea level from the tide gauge in Sydney Harbor. It shows only a tiny bit of sea level rise since the year 1890, and it shows no acceleration. I took this picture 3 years ago of Fort Denison in Sydney Harbor, where the tide gauge is located. And here's a picture of the other side of Fort Denison taken in the 19th century. The high water mark has not changed since the 19th century. This is the old picture, new one, old one, new one. There's no visible indication of sea level rise in Sydney Harbor over the last 120 years, right outside the offices of the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about some basic physics, how we can tell from looking at graphs whether or not sea level rise is accelerating. This graph plots motion of an automobile over time. Time runs along the x-axis from left to right. The yellow line is distance the car traveled, the red line is the speed the car is traveling at, and the blue line is the acceleration of the car. Just to get some basic terminology down, distance is how far the car has traveled since it started. Speed is how far the car is traveling every second. And acceleration is how much the speed is changing every second. If the speed isn't changing, there's no acceleration. And if the distance isn't changing, there's no speed. So the car starts out stopped at a traffic light, and for 10 seconds it makes no progress. But then the traffic light turns green and the car starts to accelerate. And then at 20 seconds, the next traffic light turns yellow and the car starts to slow down or decelerate. And at time 30 seconds, the car has gotten to the next red light and is sitting there motionless for the next 10 seconds. So the key thing to notice in this graph is that during times when the car is accelerating, it has an upwards curvature of the yellow line. And during times when it's decelerating, it has a downwards curvature. The same thing is true in sea level graphs. If sea level rise rates were accelerating, there would be an upwards curvature. If it was decelerating, there would be a downwards curvature. But we see neither. We see a completely straight line, indicating that sea level rise is neither accelerating nor decelerating, and it's been the same way since the 19th century. The next important principle is that water seeks a level surface. If there was increased runoff from melting glaciers pouring down into the ocean, that increased water going into the ocean would spread out and cover the entire planet. So we would see an acceleration or an upwards curvature at every single tide gauge in the world. All of the oceans are interconnected. If we suddenly added 1 meter of water to the Arctic Ocean, we would see the same thing in all the other oceans. So let's look at some other tide gauges. This is the one at the Battery in New York, which is lower Manhattan. You can see that sea level rise has been extremely linear. There's no upwards curvature, there's no downwards curvature. There's no indication of an acceleration in sea level rise. Sea level is rising at the same rate it was when Abraham Lincoln was president. Here's the tide gauge in San Francisco Bay at Alameda, California. Once again, we see no acceleration and actually very little sea level rise since 1940. And at Stockholm, Sweden, where Greta comes from, sea level actually appears to be falling. Sea level is not actually falling at Stockholm, but the land is rising, so it looks like sea level is falling. But the key thing to notice in this graph is that there's no upwards curvature. Sea level rise is not accelerating, and anyone who claims that it is either incompetent or dishonest. This is very fundamental physics. There is no indication that humans have had any impact on sea level. Now let's look at the details of the IPCC projections. On this graph, I've plotted the actual trend at Sydney Harbor and the projections which the Sydney Morning Herald are claiming for the IPCC. As you can see, the IPCC projections are baseless junk science. They're not even in the ballpark of reality. The people making these claims are not legitimate scientists. They're people who are trying to influence policy. On this date in 1988, the Canberra Times predicted that the Maldives would be completely underwater within 30 years. That would have been last year. Well, this is what the Maldives looks like today. Canberra Times, September 26, 1988. Sea level is threatening to completely cover this Indian Ocean nation of 1,196 small islands within the next 30 years, according to authorities. But the end of the Maldives and its 200,000 people could come sooner if drinking water supplies dry up by 1992, as predicted. So you can see exactly what Mencken said. The public is being menaced with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. People are so worried about sea level rise in the Maldives that you can pick up a condo for less than 11 million pounds. Having completely failed in their 1988 prediction, the press never stops. They keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. The Maldives is the extreme test for climate change action. On front line of climate change is Maldives fights rising seas. The Maldives global warming, goodbye paradise. Maldives hardest hit by the reality of climate change. A vanishing paradise. The Maldives expects to be swallowed by the seas. So let's look at what's really going on in the Maldives. People there are concerned about a huge flood of Saudi investment money. This is a very fun, happy life, says Islam Ahmed, 24, a tall, lean man chewing on areca nuts and betel leaves at one of two cafes on the less than 1 square mile island. But Mr. Ahmed and others here are bracing for a life change they fear could be catastrophic. But the catastrophic life change isn't sea level rise, it's $10 billion of Saudi investment money. Obviously, the Saudis wouldn't be investing $10 billion if they thought the islands were going to drown. But reality never gets in the way of the press. Here's a recent story from The Independent. Rising sea levels could make thousands of islands from the Maldives to Hawaii uninhabitable within decades. George Orwell said, "Early in life, I noticed that no story is ever correctly reported in a newspaper." The difference between mainstream journalism and the National Enquirer is that the National Enquirer occasionally attempts to be correct. However, in 1837, some of the Maldives Islands actually were disappearing under the water. That was back during the Little Ice Age. Friday, 17th of February, 1837, account of the Maldives. The natives observed the atolls to be wasting away. In some, the coconut trees are standing in the water. Faidi Folo Atoll is entirely gone, but is marked by a banyan tree in the water. They say that some islands have disappeared entirely. But almost 200 years later, the Maldives don't seem to be having any such problems. President Obama spent a lot of time when he was president fear-mongering about sea level rise. But he just purchased a $15 million mansion just above sea level on Martha's Vineyard. Obviously, he doesn't believe what he said, but apparently fear-mongering about climate pays extremely well. This week in 1938, Martha's Vineyard was ravaged by a major hurricane. The actor James Cagney was there at the time, and his studio was very worried about him. But fortunately, on this date in 1938, he was able to get a telegram through and let everyone know that he was okay. President Obama's favorite fear-mongering target for sea level rise was Miami. This is what Miami looks like today. But never mind reality and what you can see with your own eyes. The Guardian says Florida is about to be wiped off the map. The 1960 movie Where the Boys Are started with a helicopter flying along the beach at Fort Lauderdale, just north of Miami. And this is what the same beach looks like now. 1960, now. 1960, now. There's no indication of anything going on in Florida. So what would be the motivation for lying about sea level? One thing which comes to mind is suppose you wanted to buy cheaper property on the beach and you wanted to scare people off or drive their property values down. Another would be insurance companies. By fear-mongering about sea level, they can raise premiums without adding any increased risk on their part. Most people are very honest and they have a hard time accepting the fact that there's so much lying and fraud going on with the climate. But it's real and it's right in front of our faces. In order to understand what's going on with the climate crisis, you first have to accept the fact that there's a lot of people out there with absolutely no ethics who will say anything for money. There's no sea level crisis. There's no climate crisis. But we have a huge crisis of ethics and integrity in the academic community, the journalistic community, and the political community. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Hiller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In order to convince Americans to buy off on the global warming agenda, they have to be made completely unaware of America's hot past. When I was young, everybody knew about how hot and dry the 1930s were, but that information has been lost among the current generation. George Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." In the first part of this presentation, I'm going to show a lot of graphs. And in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to show you the American history, which is being erased. This graph made with data taken from NOAA shows that the share of U.S. land with unusually high summer temperatures has been increasing and has been at record levels recently. I saw this graph on the Our World in Data website and immediately recognized it as being fraudulent. This page from the National Climate Assessment shows very clearly that peak temperatures around most of the United States have dropped sharply over the last 60 years, which is in direct contradiction to the NOAA graph. This graph shows peak temperatures increasing over a larger percentage of the United States. This next graph shows the actual measured temperatures taken from the United States Historical Climatology Network. It shows the percent of U.S. stations reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 C sometime during the summer. As you can see, the area of the United States getting extremely hot has dropped sharply. In 1931, 93% of the country reached 95 degrees sometime during the summer. But in recent years, it's been closer to 60%. That's a very large drop. Now let's look at the same graph for 90 degrees instead of 95 degrees. Once again, we see the same thing. There has been a significant drop in the area of the United States which gets up to 90 degrees every summer. And this graph shows the percent of days above 95 degrees for all United States historical climatology network stations. In 1936, an incredible 10% of all days throughout the year were above 95 degrees. But in recent years, it's been less than half of that. So we've seen a drop in the intensity, aerial coverage, and frequency of heat waves in the United States. This NOAA graph is completely fraudulent. Now I'm going to show you how it was most likely created. This graph shows the average maximum temperature per year for every year in the United States going back to 1895. I generated it from NOAA's United States Historical Climatology Network raw monthly data set, raw meaning the actual measured data. Now I'm going to show the adjusted data set, which looks completely different. Adjusted, raw, adjusted, raw, adjusted, raw. The raw data set shows a sharp cooling trend since the 1930s, but the adjusted data set has a sharp warming trend. This warming trend is completely fake and it's due entirely to data tampering. Let's take a closer look at that. This graph shows the difference between the adjusted and the raw temperature data sets. It shows us exactly how much the data is being tampered with by NOAA. Past temperatures are being cooled by about 1.5 degrees, and present temperatures are being warmed about 1 degree. Don't pay too much attention to 2019 because the year isn't complete yet. This graph is a real hockey stick. It's a hockey stick of about 2.5 degrees of data tampering. Now I'm going to talk about how this data tampering is being done. A small portion of it is due to the time of observation bias adjustment, which I don't want to get into here, but I've demonstrated in the past that it is wildly exaggerated. I'll do another video about the time of observation bias adjustment shortly. But what I'm going to focus on in this video is showing you that most of this adjustment is due simply to making data up. Every month in their database, NOAA marks a certain percentage of the monthly temperature records as being estimated. Estimated means that the number came from a computer model rather than a thermometer. This graph shows the percent of estimated, or what I call fabricated data. Around the year 1900, more than half of the data was fabricated. That number dropped sharply till about 1940, and then it was fairly stable for a long time. But since about 1990, there's been a sharp increase in the amount of fabricated data. And once again, we're back up to about 50% fabricated data. Half of the US data is currently being made up. My next two graphs are going to break down the adjusted data into two different parts. One is the adjusted data based on actual thermometer data, and the other is the adjusted data based on fabricated data. This is the adjusted data based on actual thermometer data, and it shows that current temperatures are about the same as in the 1930s. I don't agree with this data, but it doesn't show the sharp warming trend since the 1930s, which their full data set shows. Next, let's look at the warming trend for the fabricated data. The scale of this graph is compressed quite a bit from the previous graph, but it shows about 4 degrees warming since the 1930s, and this is all based on fake data. Once again, don't pay too much attention to 2019 because the year isn't complete yet. This will probably stabilize some before the year ends. But the thing to focus on is this 4 degrees warming from the 1930s to the present in the fake data. Remember that the fake data makes up about half of the current NOAA temperature data set, and it shows a fake 4 degrees warming. And then here's the temperature graph, which gets presented to the public. This graph is a little bit different because it shows average temperatures rather than maximum temperatures, which I was showing you previously, but the shape is generally the same idea. Nighttime temperatures have warmed in the US over the last 30 years, but most of this hockey stick is again due to data tampering. It shows about 2 degrees warming since the 1930s, which is due primarily to the fake 4 degrees warming in the fabricated data. This graph is completely fraudulent and has no basis in science or reality. When you can rewrite the score of the game after the game's over, you're going to win every single time. But that's not how civil people and real scientists operate. This graph is very telling. Along the y-axis is the adjustment being made to the temperature data, and along the x-axis is atmospheric carbon dioxide. You can see that the data is being tampered with precisely to match the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In other words, the data is being adjusted to match the theory, the ultimate in junk science. Judith Curry presented my findings to NOAA a few years ago, and NOAA responded with, "Our algorithm is working exactly as designed." So apparently this fraud isn't accidental. NASA takes their data primarily from NOAA. Next, let's look at how the data tampering has affected NASA's data sets. This is the NASA US temperature graph from 1999. This year is 1934, and this year is 1998. Now let's look at their current graph with the same years highlighted. Now 1998 is warmer than 1934, and there's a warming trend. But in the 1999 version, 1934 was the hottest year, and there was a strong cooling trend. 1999 version, 2019 version, 1999 version cooling, 2019 version warming. You can see how the data tampering has turned cooling into warming. 1934 was the hottest year on record in the United States. Now I'm going to show you what it is exactly that they're hiding. This was the U.S. Weather Bureau temperature anomaly map from May 1934. The United States was blistering hot. The central portion of the country was 12 degrees above normal. That's absolutely astonishing. Now we're going to look at June, July, and August. Here's June. Once again, incredibly hot, 8 degrees above normal. July was the hottest month of all. August was almost as hot too. During 1934, the Midwest recorded 100-degree temperatures from May 7th through August 31st. There were 2,843 readings over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the Midwest during that period. Peak temperatures were 116 degrees in the Midwest. There were 2 heat waves over 100 degrees during May. During June, it went up to almost 110 degrees. Several heat waves in July, which got up to 116 degrees. Another one in early August, and it was still over 100 degrees at the end of August. Now let's compare the 2,843 temperature readings over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the Midwest during the summer of 1934 to this summer. This year, there was 1 temperature reading over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was probably bogus. In 1934, it got up to 116 degrees. This year, it probably didn't even get up to 100 degrees. Now compare this to the NOAA graph, which shows heat waves worse now than they were in the 1930s. It's just complete nonsense. It has no basis in reality. The area of the U.S. getting extremely hot has plummeted since the 1930s to record lows. 2014 was the lowest on record. Let's look now at what NOAA and NASA are trying to make disappear from 1934. July 24th, 1934 was the hottest day on record in Chicago, 109 degrees at the airport. On July 26, 1934, there were people dying all over the Midwest, and it was 100 degrees in Alaska. Imagine the mass hysteria if it reached 100 degrees in Alaska now. This map shows temperatures around the United States on July 26, 1934. The purple dots represent 100 degrees, red dots represent 90 degrees. There were 100-degree temperatures from coast to coast. This never happens anymore. Look at these temperatures from the last week of May and the first week of June in 1934. Over 100 degrees every single day in the Midwest. Over 110 degrees on May 30th. This is incomprehensible now. 80% of the U.S. was in drought during the summer of 1934. The world was heating up. Ice was dissolving at the poles. Sea level was going to rise 40 feet. This page is from the Los Angeles Times on December 30th, 1934. Hand of nature falls heavily on whole world in freak weather year of 1934. Cold, heat, drought, and flood set new marks. How science accounts for berserk elements. Unprecedented extremes recorded in every corner of the earth. Even climate has changed in spots. A freak year, change in climate. Assigned reasons vary from spots on the sun to concurrences of meteorological cycles. On June 22, 1934, the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau said that a worldwide drought was likely. Weatherman admits there is something wrong and that no one knows why. One thing we know for sure is that the record heat, drought, and berserk weather of 1934 was not caused by carbon dioxide, and that's why NOAA and NASA feel the need to erase it. Here's an article from the Mercury in Australia from June 4th, 1934. World drought, farmers' ruinous losses, almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. England was having their worst drought in 100 years. Manchester Guardian, Saturday, May 12, 1934. New York darkened by vast dust cloud. Freak weather in United States. Heat wave and drought hit the farmers. High temperatures in Britain. This is in early May. Melbourne, Australia was having their hottest weather in 25 years, and bushfires were all over South Australia. The 1934 drought was unparalleled. The press in 1934 was reporting on melting Arctic ice and said that New York was going to drown, just like they do now. Here's an interesting page from August 20th, 1934. 1934, driest and hottest year yet. Washington, August 20th. The year 1934, the driest and hottest year on record thus far. The Weather Bureau says so and has been keeping tab on precipitation and temperature for 70 years. The drought has been aggravated by sizzling heat. Nothing remotely approaching the severity for this combination appears in the annals of the Weather Bureau. J.B. Kinser, Weather Bureau meteorologist, said today. Other drought years, notably in 1894 to 1895, 1910, 1914, and 1930, were exceedingly dry in many sections, he said, but no previous 12 months has shown generally deficient rainfall during April, May, June, and July. Something very severe was going on with the weather around the world during the year 1934, and obviously NOAA and NASA don't want you to know about it, so they're rewriting America's history. And on the right is another article from the same page of the same newspaper that day. Hitler changed section of will. Paris, August 20th. The newspaper Paris Soir charged today that the will of the late President Paul von Hindenburg of Germany had been falsified so as to eliminate a recommendation that former Kaiser Wilhelm should succeed him. The newspaper said the last section of the will was written by Paul Goebbels, Nazi minister of propaganda. Rewriting history is always a big part of seizing power and control. Nothing has changed. If Americans were aware of the heat, drought, and extreme weather of our past, no one would buy off on the climate crisis scam. Erasing the heat of 1934 is essential for the propagandists. In order to stop this takeover of the U.S. energy supply, we need to get the CO2 endangerment finding of the EPA reversed. The EPA endangerment finding is the legal document which they can and will use to shut down the fossil fuel supply of the United States, which we all depend on day to day. If you care about the future of America, do everything you can to get the CO2 endangerment finding revisited and reversed. The people behind this showed us this week that they're willing to terrorize children and use them for propaganda. They do not have good intentions. What they've done to Greta Thunberg and how they've frightened, terrorized, used, and abused her is absolutely despicable. A few years ago, climate alarmists terrorized this family in Argentina so much that they committed suicide and shot their baby over global warming fears. The baby survived, but she's an orphan now, and her brother died too in the global warming terror attack. People like this little girl and Greta Thunberg are paying a very real price for global warming fraud. She's dropped out of school, and she's terrified. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to talk about the key danger facing America's future. Shortly after Barack Obama took office, the EPA issued their CO2 endangerment finding. I'll read this description of it from the National Resources Defense Council. In 2009, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency issued its science-based finding that the buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere endangers public health and welfare. The endangerment finding reflects the overwhelming scientific evidence on the causes and impacts of climate change. It was made through a thorough rulemaking process considering thousands of public comments and was upheld by the federal courts. The endangerment finding requires the EPA to take action under the Clean Air Act to curb emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and 4 other heat-trapping air pollutants from vehicles, power plants, and other industries. So since this rule was passed, carbon dioxide has been classified as a dangerous pollutant. And the EPA has the authority now to shut down people and industries which emit carbon dioxide. Let's look now at who emits carbon dioxide. The burning of fossil fuels emits about 6.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide every year. Plant respiration emits about 50 billion tons of CO2, soil respiration emits about 60 billion, and the oceans emit about 90 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. If you add it all up, fossil fuel burning is less than 5% of annual CO2 emissions. So if the EPA wanted to go after the really big emitters of carbon dioxide, that would be plants, soils, and the ocean. It's interesting that carbon dioxide is considered a pollutant, considering that it's the basis of all life on Earth. The process of plant growth requires sunlight, carbon dioxide, chlorophyll, and water. Green plants consist of compounds which were formed from carbon dioxide and water molecules. These combine with chlorophyll, which is the chemical which makes plants green, and sunlight to produce oxygen and plant growth. Life can't exist without carbon dioxide, and commercial greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into their greenhouses to make the plants grow faster. If CO2 was a pollutant, commercial greenhouse operators would obviously not be pumping it into the air around their plants. The whole concept of carbon dioxide being a pollutant under the Clean Air Act is absurd. I fought hard for the Clean Air Act and never thought it would be abused like this. Now let's look at some of the junk science and propaganda surrounding carbon dioxide folklore. These are typical photographs reported by the press when they're doing articles about carbon dioxide. Cutting carbon emissions, carbon pollution, carbon emissions, carbon pollution. They all show visible emissions from smokestacks, but carbon dioxide is invisible. And as a result of all this bad reporting, propaganda, and misinformation, Greta Thunberg believes that she can see carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless trace gas, which is essential for life on Earth. It's unfortunate that the UN's climate expert has such a fundamental misunderstanding of the properties of carbon dioxide. But not at all surprising given that journalists and many politicians share the same misconceptions. Greta Thunberg gave an angry speech at the UN yesterday, accusing adults of stealing her dreams. I completely agree with her. It's just not the adults who she thinks it is. I'll be talking about that at the end of the video. When Greta Thunberg and everybody else exhales, they emit about 40,000 parts per million carbon dioxide out of their mouth. The purpose of human lungs is to combine oxygen from the air and carbon compounds in our bloodstream. This burning process produces energy which powers our body, and the byproduct is that carbon dioxide emissions are exhaled out of our mouth and nose. If carbon dioxide was visible, as many people on the left believe, there would be a big cloud visible coming out of her mouth. Obviously, that's not the case. According to the United Nations forecast from 1989, yesterday's speech should have been impossible anyway. The world should have been destroyed before Greta was born. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. This all would have happened a few years before Greta was born. And Greta couldn't have given her speech on the same date in 1938 because New York and New England were facing a massive hurricane. New York Times, Friday, September 23rd, 1938. Storm toll 462, thousands homeless, 250 killed in the Providence area. New England still battles floods. And this is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like that day. The 1938 hurricane was the worst hurricane that's hit New York in the past century, and carbon dioxide levels were below 310 parts per million at the time. I'm going to guess that none of the adults around Greta told her about the 1938 hurricane. Now let's talk about the history of how many people came to be afraid of carbon dioxide. In the late 19th century, a Swedish scientist named Svante Arrhenius came up with a theory that carbon dioxide emissions were going to produce a huge amount of warming. I'm going to read this article from January 1913, The Coming Exodus to Siberian Canada. One of the greatest scientists in the world is Arrhenius of Sweden. He's a chemist and physicist and has studied this matter. He shows that this proportion of carbon dioxide in the air will make the climate warmer by acting like the glass roof of a greenhouse. With the carbon dioxide increased from 2 1/2 to 3 times, the temperature of the whole world will be raised 8 to 9 degrees centigrade, and Greenland will have a good climate for farming. All the good soil of Canada will be as temperate as a climate is now enjoyed by Missouri. Corn will be grown in the Peace River Valley. Oranges will be an orchard fruit in Arkansas and Virginia. The suburban residents of Chicago may literally sit under their own fig trees and grape arbors. Cotton will be a stable crop in Iowa. Bananas will fringe the shores of the Gulf. Siberia will become the greatest farming country in the world. The great Antarctic continent, one of the greatest on Earth in extent, will be the Western Canada, the Scandinavia, the Siberia of that day, and will have millions of people. Alaska will be as warm as Maine now is, and the heat of all the tropics will be made hotter for thousands of years. The increased heat will cause more evaporation of water vapor from the oceans. As what goes up must come down, this will cause moisture climates almost everywhere, and our dry farming sections will become as wet as Ohio. And then the passengers on this good ship Earth will have vast fields of good land, which are not good now, upon which to multiply, as it seems to be their fate to do. All this will take place in a time shorter than the history of England since the Norman Conquest, in twice the time which has elapsed since the governor's palace was built in Santa Fe, New Mexico, our youngest state. So there's two interesting things to notice here. One is that they thought global warming was going to be a good thing, and two, Arrhenius had no idea what he was talking about. Siberia is not showing any signs of becoming a great farming country. Arrhenius was also a big proponent of solar energy and said in 1925 that the world would run out of oil within a generation. Arrhenius also believed that children's development could be enhanced by passing electricity through them, and he did experiments in public schools in Stockholm, Sweden, which might explain some of Greta's learning disabilities. In 1901, Knut Angstrom explained the problems with Arrhenius' theories about carbon dioxide. Angstrom did an experiment where he showed that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already absorbed just about all of the available radiation, which meant that adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere would have very little effect on Earth's radiative balance. And Angstrom explained what Arrhenius did wrong. Arrhenius failed to account for water vapor as a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and it's much more abundant in the atmosphere. Arrhenius attributed the entire greenhouse effect to carbon dioxide, when in fact it's only a minor component. The primary greenhouse gas is water vapor. So Arrhenius' mistake has led to decades of superstition and ultimately to the CO2 endangerment finding of the EPA. In 1941, the United States Department of Agriculture confirmed Angstrom's experiment. Much has been written about varying amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a possible cause of glacial periods. The theory received a fatal blow when it was realized that carbon dioxide is very selective as to the wavelengths of radiant energy it will absorb, filtering out only such waves as even very minute quantities of water vapor dispose of anyway. No probable increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide can materially affect either the amount of insulation reaching the surface or the amount of terrestrial radiation lost to space. So once again, they're saying that the carbon dioxide spectra is already saturated and that adding more carbon dioxide will make very little difference. In 1971, the top experts from NASA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research confirmed Angstrom's experiment again. Their paper was titled Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide and Aerosols, Effects of Large Increases on Global Climate. The main conclusion of this part of the study is that even an order of magnitude increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by human activities, which at the present rate of input is not expected within the next several thousand years, may not be sufficient to produce a runaway greenhouse effect on Earth. Scientists have known for a long time that Arrhenius's predictions were wildly exaggerated, yet we still have the CO2 endangerment finding hanging over our heads. Let's talk now about what we do know about climate. This is from the same 1941 USDA article I was discussing earlier. It will be news to many people that man, during his geologically brief existence on Earth, has never known a normal climate. We're now at the tail end of an ice age and living in a period of crustal and climatic violence as great as any the Earth has ever known. This is why we have to think so much about the weather. Such periods of revolution have occurred briefly several times in the history of the Earth. Between them have been the far longer periods of crustal peace and a genial climatic uniformity, the normal times of the geologist. So what the article is saying is that we live in an unusual period of extreme weather, and it has nothing to do with carbon dioxide, as they explained later in the article. One of my degrees is in geology, and I spent a lot of time working as a geologist, and one of the things geologists have to know about is Earth's climate history. This chart is also from the 1941 U.S. Department of Agriculture paper, and it shows the development of life over geologic time on Earth. If we go back 600 million years in time and start moving towards the present, we see abundant life in the seas, oldest known fishes, oldest land plants and animals, amphibians and forests on lands, amphibians dominant on land. And then if we look at the chart on the right, we can see what atmospheric CO2 levels and Earth's temperature was at the time all these things were occurring. Atmospheric CO2 levels are shown as the black line, and you can see they were very high back then, about 7,000 parts per million, more than 10 times higher than they are now. This information alone is enough to tell us that climate alarmism is based on complete nonsense. Life thrived on Earth when CO2 levels were 10 to 20 times higher than they are now. Corals evolved, shellfish evolved. Obviously, ocean acidification was not a problem when CO2 levels were much higher. Corals thrived at high CO2 levels and high temperatures. Temperatures were more than 10 C warmer than they are now. During periods of Earth warming, the tropics expand. Corals like warm water, so their range expands. They move to higher latitudes. Every serious geologist knows that the climate crisis is complete nonsense. And Michael Mann is not an exception to this rule because he's not a serious scientist. This is what Earth looked like at high CO2 levels. Life thrived. The whole idea of an extinction rebellion is based on mass superstition and hysteria. It has nothing to do with science. We know from looking at Earth's past that life does very well at high CO2 levels, which is the reason why greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere of their greenhouse. They want the plants to grow faster. We also know from history what the climate was like at lower CO2 levels. Let's take a look at that next. These graphs from the National Climate Assessment show that heat waves were much worse in the United States when CO2 levels were much lower. Heat waves peaked in the U.S. during the 1930s and have been generally declining ever since. And it's important to realize that the United States has by far the best temperature records in the world. This is what the Midwest looked like in the 1930s when carbon dioxide levels were about 310 parts per million. It wasn't a pretty sight. Now let's go back even further. The history of the world's droughts goes back to the year 627, when in France and Germany, thousands of human beings died of thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up, and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from heat in France. Greta has obviously been lied to by the adults around her. Lower CO2 levels do not produce a good climate. History shows us that unequivocally. Now let's look at fires. The worst fires in U.S. history occurred in 1871. This was the Chicago fire when the whole city burned down. And on the same day in 1871 as the Chicago fire, massive fires broke out all around the Great Lakes. Peshtigo, Wisconsin was completely wiped out and more than 1,000 people died. Forest fire burn acreage in the United States is down about 80% since the 1930s. What about tornadoes? The worst tornado in U.S. history occurred in 1925. It covered several states and destroyed dozens of towns. More than 1,000 people were killed and 3,000 people injured. And what about tropical storms? These charts show the 10 deadliest Pacific typhoons and the 10 deadliest Atlantic hurricanes. All but 2 occurred with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million, which is what climate alarmists claim is the safe point. It's interesting to note how many of them occurred around the time of the U.S. Revolutionary War. The deadliest Atlantic hurricane occurred in 1780, which was also the year of the 3rd deadliest Pacific typhoon. The 6th deadliest Atlantic hurricane occurred in 1776, and the 8th occurred in 1775. So apparently emissions from George Washington's sport utility horse were responsible. This is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like during the hurricane of 1815. Rhode Island Senator Whitehouse believes that he can stop hurricanes through a carbon tax, but history tells us otherwise. This week in 1926, Miami was destroyed by a massive Category 4 hurricane. It was the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history, inflation adjusted. The Red Cross rated 1927 as the worst year in their history and reported 111 disasters, including the worst flooding on record in the United States along the Mississippi River. Vermont also had their worst flooding in 1927 along the Winooski River. 1,000 bridges were wiped out and the lieutenant governor drowned. St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado in 1927. We've been very lucky in recent years that we haven't suffered catastrophes on the scale of 1927. The deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history occurred in Galveston, Texas in the year 1900. A 15-foot storm surge wiped out almost the entire city and killed 10,000 people. Darwin, Australia was completely destroyed by Cyclone Tracy on Christmas Day 1974. The city had to be abandoned for about a year. The deadliest natural disaster in world history occurred in China in 1931. A massive flood drowned 3 million people and left tens of millions. 2 inches of rain fell in 5 minutes at Alamogordo Creek, New Mexico. In 1881, 2.3 inches of rain fell in 12 minutes at Embarrass, Wisconsin. In 1871, almost 4 inches of rain fell in 15 minutes at Galveston, Texas. In 1935, Woodward Ranch, Texas set the world record rainfall of 22 inches of rain in 2 hours and 45 minutes. And in 1942, Smithward, Pennsylvania, in 3 hours had 28.5 inches of rain. That's just unbelievable. And a few hours before the 1935 rainfall at Woodward Ranch, Texas, a nearly as large storm hit eastern Colorado, which caused massive flooding on the Republican River in Nebraska, which killed 250 people. 1936 brought the worst heat waves in U.S. history and also brought some of the largest floods on March 21st. This is what Pittsburgh looked like on the day when my grandfather had to be evacuated from downtown Pittsburgh by boat. And here was the headline, All Eastern America Under Floodwaters. I guess Greta couldn't have given her speech that day. Greta has been under the influence of a climate predator named Kevin Anderson, who's been scaring her for political purposes. So now let's discuss what's wrong with the CO2 endangerment finding. We know from history that life thrived at high CO2 levels. We see no indication in the historical record that there was a problem with ocean acidification. And we can also see from the historical record that there's no reason to believe that lower CO2 levels would mean less extreme weather. The endangerment finding is based on superstition, not science. But what the endangerment finding does do is it provides the legal basis for climate alarmists to shut down the U.S. energy supply, which we all depend on for our day-to-day survival. Imagine what would happen if anti-fracking activists were successful and people drove to the gas station and they couldn't buy gasoline. Mass chaos would ensue. We all depend on having electricity or natural gas during the winter when it's very cold outside. Without it, millions of people would freeze to death. Our food supply, our transportation, our communications, our internet, our computers, everything depends on a reliable 24/7 source of power. We can't afford to have our hospital operating room shut down because the wind isn't blowing that day or because it's dark out. Children today are used to having everything they need always available to them, and they have absolutely no concept of what it's like to live without them. Even having a weak phone signal is a disaster for many young people. My other degree is in electrical engineering. No serious engineer believes that we can go 100% renewable. It's just not realistic. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and there's huge environmental impacts involved with both the solar and the wind industry, which climate alarmists don't want to talk about. The 100% renewable target is nothing more than nonsense being propagated by politicians. Bernie Sanders wants a $14 trillion program to solve a problem which doesn't even exist. That would be about $100,000 per family devoted to nothing but superstition. If climate alarmists are successful at shutting down the fossil fuel supply via the CO2 endangerment finding, it would be the biggest disaster in U.S. history. They must be stopped. Every serious-minded American needs to be in touch with their politicians and tell them to revisit the CO2 endangerment finding. I have no ties to the fossil fuel industry, and as a lifelong environmentalist and a cyclist, I would love to see 90% of the cars off the road, but shutting down the fossil fuel supply is simply insane. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.
I just have to say that I object strenuously to your use of the word hilarious. To me, this feels a lot like your reaction to being named in one of these manifestos. Now, you're of course not responsible for the words of somebody writing that document, but I do think that laughing at it is a real problem because these are real families that are impacted by this violence. And I think our efforts towards talking about this have to start from a place of mutual respect, which is what I've heard from this side of the table. Now, the reason we don't have those numbers, I want those numbers as much as you do, but to say the numbers don't show something is simply not supported by the data.
Okay, and I have 38 seconds left, Ms. Mulligan, if you want to respond within that time.
The only thing I would add is that it's in the name. Terrorism, domestic terrorism, it terrorizes us. It terrorizes us in our homes. It terrorizes us in our schools. And to the points made by the other panelists, it is disproportionate to its impact on any individual life, and it's not.
You reject the idea it's something that doesn't matter or doesn't really matter?
Absolutely reject.
Okay. All right, so here's where we are. Every member now has had 5 minutes in. Okay, and Mr. Clay, so we have 2 members who have not. So I'm going to go to the 2 members who have not yet, and we'll give an opportunity for a closing thought to any member who wants before we go.
Am I next?
respond, or is Mr. Meadows?
I thought Mr. Meadows was
Mr.
next.
Meadows, okay.
Mr. Meadows is next, then Mr. Clay, then to you, Mr. Jordan.
Ms. Owens, obviously this is a gang up on you. You know, we're giving these witnesses the ability to do a rebuttal on you, and so you know, I find it unfair, Ms. Ballou. I mean, you know, candidly, for you to show mutual respect and then you to go after Ms. Owens, it's not appropriate. So, Ms. Owens, you can have 4 minutes and 34 seconds to respond. However,
yield for a second.
I'll yield.
Thank you. I believe, Ms. Owens, when you used the word hilarious, it was referencing the fact that no one had asked you a question. It wasn't to the subject matter of the hearing. Is that right?
That is correct.
And to have another witness insinuate something that is not accurate is just not appropriate, Mr. Chairman, for how witnesses are supposed to behave in front of this committee. I also think you didn't say it doesn't matter about the subject matter of today's hearing. You said there are other subjects that matter as well, and maybe we should spend some time on those. Is that accurate?
That is correct, and they matter much, 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 much more. And I have said that. I said that in my opening, and I will say it again. You know that white supremacy and white nationalism ranks nowhere near the top of the issues that are facing Black America. And the reason that you are bringing them up in this room is because it is attempt to make the election all about race as the Democrats.
Not in my case, Ms. Owens. I'm sorry. Please do not characterize my motive.
Mr. Chairman, it's my time.
Yeah,
it's my time.
You've got your time, Mr. Meadows. I'll give you 3 more seconds.
Every 4 years, you bring up race, and you knew exactly what I meant when I said hilarious, and you just tried to do live what the media does all the time to Republicans, to our president, and to conservatives, but you tried to manipulate what I said to fit your narrative, okay? I was not referring to the subject matter that is hilarious. I said it's hilarious that we are sitting in this room today, and I've got 2 doctors and a missus, and nobody can give us real numbers that we can respond to so we can assess how big of a threat this is, because you know that it is not as big of a threat as you are trying to make it out to be so that you can manipulate. And the audacity of you to bring up the Christchurch shooting manifesto and make it seem as if I laughed at people that were slaughtered by a homicidal maniac is, in my opinion, absolutely despicable. And I think that we should be above that. To try to assign reality or any meaning to a homicidal maniac writing a manifesto, which, by the way, let the record show, also stated Spyro the Dragon, the child's cartoon, as a source of inspiration. He also cited Nelson Mandela as a source of information. I don't think that Nelson Mandela has inspired mosque shootings. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong. You would rather assign meaning to a homicidal maniac than to actually address the things that I said today that are actually harming Black America. Number 1, father absence. Number 2, the education system and the illiteracy rate. Illegal immigration ranks high, abortion ranks high, white supremacy and white nationalism, if I had to make a list again of 100 things, would not be on it. This hearing, in my opinion, is a farce. And it is ironic that you're sitting here and you're having 3 Caucasian people testify and tell you what their expertise are. Do I know what my expertise are? Black in America. I've been Black in America my whole life, all 30 years. And I can tell you that you guys have done the exact same thing every 4 years ahead of an election cycle, and it needs to stop.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Carl Sagan said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Climate alarmists want to remake our entire economic, social, and energy infrastructure. Bernie Sanders just unveiled his $14 trillion plan, which would cost each American family about $100,000. In this video, I'm going to look at whether or not alarmist claims about Arctic sea ice are extraordinary and meet Sagan's criteria. Every day, we're hammered with news stories about how the Arctic is in crisis and will soon be ice-free. This graph from the National Climate Assessment starts in 1979 and shows sea ice extent declining by almost 50% since then. It looks a little bit extraordinary. Let's take a closer look at it. In my previous video, I showed how the National Climate Assessment is hiding all of the pre-1979 Arctic sea ice data when extent was much lower. Arctic sea ice, like almost all processes in nature, is cyclical. But by starting their graph at the top of a cycle, the National Climate Assessment is trying to make you think that Arctic sea ice is linear. Based on the cherry-picked graphs of climate alarmists, around the year 2007, we started seeing all kinds of forecasts of imminent ice doom. 2008, expert Arctic polar cap may disappear this summer. 2008, North Pole may be ice-free for the first time this summer. National Geographic News. Swimmer aims to kayak to the North Pole, August 2008, BBC News. Could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? Arctic sea ice gone in summer within 5 years. Seth Borenstein, Associated Press, National Geographic News, 2007. Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. BBC News, December 2007. Gore, polar ice cap may disappear by summer 2014. Naval Postgraduate School, NASA, Arctic ice gone by 2014. In 2008, the world's leading climate alarmist, James Hansen of NASA, said the Arctic would be ice-free by 2018. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Sierra Club, why Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. Mark Hartsgaard, the end of the Arctic Ocean could be ice-free by 2015. Ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe. Scientist, The Guardian, 2013. Peter Wadhams, Cambridge University, estimates that 2017 or 2018 will see the first ice-free Arctic summer. These are extraordinary claims. Now let's look at the evidence. This is what Arctic sea ice extent has done over the last 13 years since the alarmists started making all these predictions of imminent doom. This graph shows data from the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index, and it shows Arctic sea ice extent for every day going back to the minimum in 2006. As you can see in this graph, Arctic sea ice extent is cyclical. It goes to a minimum in the summer and a maximum in the winter. The straight line is the trend line since the 2006 minimum. As you can see, it's hardly changed at all. There has been a very slight and statistically insignificant downwards trend since the 2006 minimum. So when Nobel laureate Al Gore made his forecast of an ice-free Arctic by 2014, it's pretty clear that the evidence was not extraordinary. This graph shows annual cycles of our planet's weather as controlled by the orbit around the sun. Now let's look at longer-term cycles. This graph shows ice age cycles. The blue line is temperature variation over the last 450,000 years, taken from Antarctic ice cores. During ice ages, Earth's temperature drops quite a bit, and then we come out of the ice ages quickly and Earth warms up again. Does this over and over again, yet another climatic cycle. We are very fortunate that Earth's climate operates in cycles. Otherwise, it would keep getting colder and Earth would end up like Pluto, or it would keep getting hotter and we would end up like Venus. Now we're going to look at a cool demonstration of cyclical behavior from Harvard University. We're going to look at a video of pendulums of different lengths and see all the different cycles they create. I thought that was pretty amazing. Next, let's look at another Earth cycle. This is Arctic temperatures going back to the year 1900, taken at the capital of Iceland. Eastern Arctic temperatures warmed a lot from 1920 to 1940, and then they cooled a lot from 1940 to 1979. Does that date sound familiar? And then they warmed a lot since 1979. So, of course, Arctic alarmists cherry-picked their start date for their sea ice graphs during the coldest year on record in the eastern Arctic. They start their Arctic sea ice graphs right in 1979 at the beginning of a warming period, so of course Arctic sea ice extent is declining. This is not extraordinary evidence, this is extraordinary deception. This next graph overlays in red an ocean circulation pattern, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO. The graph provides strong evidence that Iceland temperatures are controlled by ocean circulation patterns, which are cyclical, rather than a linear increase in carbon dioxide. There's lots of historical evidence that the Arctic was very warm around 1940. December 17th, 1939, glaciers melting over Greenland. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Ullmann, Swedish geologist. It may, without exaggeration, be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. April 8, 1954, world's temperature getting warmer. In Spitsbergen, one of the places where accurate temperature records have been kept, the local temperature average has risen 18 degrees Fahrenheit since 1910, and the port is now open 200 days a year, nearly 50 days longer than it was back in the early 1900s. February 18, 1952, polar ice thaw increasing. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said tonight that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. It should be pretty clear now why Arctic alarmists pretend they don't know anything about the years before 1979. To finish this video up, I'm going to show you another demonstration of how you can create any trend you want by cherry-picking your start and end dates. This graph is Arctic sea ice extent from 2007 to 2017, and this line is the trend line. I'm going to move it around and you'll see how the trend line moves. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. We can create any trend we want if we're willing to cheat with our data. Now I'm going to show you another alarmist trick, which is to zoom in and make the slope much steeper. Here, let's do that now. See, I zoomed in and now the slope looks much larger in whichever direction we want to make it look. Mark Twain said there are three kinds of lies. There's lies, damned lies, and statistics. Arctic alarmists use statistics to enhance their lies. Climate alarmism is not based on extraordinary evidence. Rather, it's based on extraordinary deception. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The press says we're in a climate crisis, and they should know because they've been reporting that for about a century. They tell us that we have less than 4 months to save the planet from global warming. June 29th, 2017, 4 years to save the Earth. 2020 is the deadline to avert climate catastrophe, experts claim in chilling commentary. When it comes to climate, timing is everything, Nature commentary said. And now here's another story from 2004. The Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. Britain will be Siberian in less than 20 years. Britain is plunged into a Siberian climate by 2020. Nuclear conflict, megadroughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world. So apparently all of that is going to happen in the next 4 months. And at the same time which Britain is going to become Siberian, it's also going to become Mediterranean, and English gardens are going to look like this. And in 2004, the chief scientist of the UK, David King, said that everybody was going to have to move to Antarctica because the rest of the world was going to be too hot. It's a shame that all those people from Britain are going to have to leave their Mediterranean gardens in their Siberian climate. But it's all worse than it seems. 30 years ago, the UN said that the climate catastrophe was going to occur by the year 2000. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees threatening political chaos, said Brown, the director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. And here's the same story from the New York Times and PBS in 1986. Earth's climatic crisis examined by NOVA. Picking up where a high school chemistry class might end, NOVA, the public broadcasting science series, offers the non-matriculating viewer an advanced course in worrying. The cause of the concern is all the carbon dioxide that's being pumped into the industrialized and motorized air. I can't remember ever actually seeing industrialized and motorized air. Perhaps the New York Times could help us out with that. And then they say the hour-long broadcast is called The Climate Crisis, The Greenhouse Effect at 9 tonight on Channel 13. The conclusion, conveyed with great authority by several big league climatologists from government and private research organizations, is terrible. By the year 2000, the atmosphere and weather will grow warmer by several degrees, and life, animal, plant, and human will be threatened. Melting ice caps, flooded cities, droughts in the Corn Belt, and famine. So apparently the world ended 20 years ago, but pretending that it didn't, let's look at how these experts did. This is the graph for drought in the Corn Belt from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Green periods are wet, brown periods are dry, and this is when that NOVA show was presented. As you can see, it's actually been very wet in the Corn Belt since these forecasts of doom were made. In fact, they've had the fewest droughts on record. This is the graph of corn yields in the United States going back to the middle of the 19th century. As you can see, they keep growing to record levels every year. As carbon dioxide has increased, corn yields have increased with them. This is partly because plants grow faster in higher CO2 environments. That's why people who operate commercial greenhouses pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere inside their greenhouse. Plants love carbon dioxide and they can't grow without it. That report by big league climatologists conveyed with great authority was made back here in 1986, and since then corn yields have nearly doubled. And what about the famine they warned about? This graph from Oxford University shows global deaths by famine for every decade going back to the 1860s. You can see that the current decade is by far the lowest on record, and that deaths from famine have plummeted over the last 50 years. When I was a kid growing up in the 1960s, there were huge numbers of people starving to death in China and India. We don't see that anymore. And in fact, China's had 1,800 major famines since the year 108 BC, which is pretty near a famine a year, according to the nation's own official records. In the 2-year-long famine of 1877 and 1878, it's estimated that 9,500,000 persons starved to death. So many millions died in the famines of 1887, 1889, 1911, and 1916 that enumeration was little better than a guess. It's interesting to note that these famine years in China also coincided with heat wave years in the United States and Europe. That tells me that the climate is controlled by something other than carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide levels were very low back then. So in 1986, big league climatologists told us that we're all going to die from global warming by the year 2000. But 12 years earlier, they had a completely different story. New ice age to begin soon, scientific data shows. They imply that the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. And in 1976, frequently freakish weather. Some scientists theorize that the freakish weather of recent years is the product of a global cooling trend that began in the 1940s. Advocates of this theory predict that the worldwide temperature drop could usher in a little ice age similar to the one that lasted roughly from 1600 to 1850. A CIA report supporting the global cooling thesis was released last month. It warned that world food supplies could be threatened if the cooling trend continued. The stability of most nations is based on a dependable source of food, but this stability will not be possible under the new climate era, the report said. The politics of food will become the central issue of every government. May 4th, 1976, climatic changes would bring global unrest, CIA report says. Major climatic changes will bring about global unrest of a proportion almost beyond comprehension, heightening the risk of international conflict, according to the CIA report released today. And here is the CIA report. There is a growing consensus among leading climatologists that the world is undergoing a cooling trend. The press tells us that we're not allowed to argue against the consensus of scientists, so the world must be undergoing a cooling trend. And here's one from a leading scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I'll be riding my bicycle in a few minutes. The Boston Globe, Thursday, April 16, 1970. Scientist predicts a new ice age by the 21st century. The demands for cooling water will boil dry the entire flow of the rivers and streams of the continental United States. Lodge, speaking at the Institute of Environmental Sciences at the Sheraton in Boston, said 3 factors could prevent these disasters: population control, a less wasteful standard of living, and a major technological breakthrough in the way man consumes the Earth's resources. Scientists were busy thinking up all kinds of technological breakthroughs to stop global cooling. The cooling world, climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than those they solve. So 45 years ago, scientists wanted to put soot on the Arctic to stop global cooling. And now they want to put soot in the stratosphere to stop global warming. Scientists were so worried about global cooling in 1972 that 42 top American and European investigators sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. I'm not sure what they were worried about, though, because in 1970 they said that the oceans will be as dead as Lake Erie by the year 1980, and that America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. So an ice age seems like the least of their problems. I was playing on the soccer team at Arizona State University in 1974, and I remember getting pretty hungry and pretty thirsty a few times. Phoenix had their all-time record heat wave that year in 1974, 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees, and that was right at the peak of the Ice Age scare. The New York Times and scientists were so worried about overpopulation in 1969 that they proposed poisoning food and water being shipped to third world countries. November 25, 1969, a sterility drug in food is hinted. Biologist stresses need to curb population growth. A possibility that the government might have to put sterility drugs in reservoirs and in food shipped to foreign countries to limit human multiplication was envisioned today by a leading crusader on the population problem. I remember this guy very well, and in fact, he's still active with climate alarmism. Progressives loved him. And by 1967, it was already too late to stop the famine. Dire famine forecast by 75. So in the 60s, we were all going to freeze to death and die of famine if we didn't poison third world countries' water. But a decade earlier, the problem was global warming. February 18, 1952, polar ice thaw increasing. Glaciers said to be melting. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said tonight that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. Same story in the 1940s. Saturday, May 31st, 1947, Arctic phenomenon. Warming of climate causes concern. The possibility of a prodigious rise in the surface of the ocean with resultant widespread inundation arising from an Arctic climatic phenomenon was discussed yesterday by Dr. Hans Alman, a noted Swedish geophysicist at the University of California Geophysical Institute. He said that temperatures in the Arctic had increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from a scientific standpoint. The Arctic change is so serious that I hope an international agency can speedily be formed to study the conditions on a global basis. He pointed out that whereas in 1910 the navigable season along western Spitsbergen lasted 3 months, it now lasted 8 months. This is the same location where climate warriors trapped in the ice had to be rescued a few weeks ago. If we go back 80 years ago, it's the same thing, global warming. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Alman, Swedish geologist. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And in 1937, a noted Arctic explorer said the temperatures were reported along the Yukon River above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Imagine the mass hysteria if that happened now. And here's a story from the 1920s about some women who tried to drive to the Arctic Ocean. Through Belgium, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Lapland, and Finland, the motor party journeyed to 270 miles north of the Arctic Circle, prepared for freezing weather. To their continued astonishment, the temperature was never less than 90 degrees in the shade. The intention was to reach the Arctic Ocean, but 40 miles of marsh country, i.e. melted permafrost, on the coast prevented this. An average of 210 miles a day was made on the journey, which was arduous in the extreme, and at one time the car had an actual race with death among the forest fires in Sweden over terrible roads. Imagine that, 90-degree temperatures in the Arctic, melted permafrost, and massive forest fires 90 years ago. And here's a story from November 1922 in the Monthly Weather Review. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. So there was no ice around Spitsbergen during the winter of 1922, but a few weeks ago, climate warriors got trapped there in the middle of summer. And the press was reporting exactly the same stories in 1934. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world, and they had a picture of Manhattan underwater from melting ice. And here's the same picture from Climate Central 85 years later, Manhattan underwater. And they say that in order to stop this, you need to send them money. In 1988, the world's leading climatologist from NASA, Dr. James Hansen, predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years, which would have been last year. So you better send your money off to Climate Central quick. But a savior has arisen to rescue us from all these climate disasters. Bernie Sanders has a $16 trillion climate plan to save us from global warming, and that works out to a bargain of only $100,000 per family. He says that if every family in America simply gives him $100,000, he can end fossil fuel use by the year 2050. I personally like being able to have food, communications, light, heat, and all the other amenities of a modern lifestyle. And it isn't clear to me why I would want to give $100,000 to Bernie to ruin our civilization. And if he can't do it until the year 2050, it'll be too late anyway, because the Washington Post says the world's going to end in less than 12 years. Reality is that people are living better and better. The percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty has plummeted over the last century. And a lot of people used to die in natural disasters around the earth, but now it's very few. Death rates from natural disasters have plummeted over the past century. So what exactly are we giving Bernie Sanders $100,000 of our family's money for? The whole thing is completely insane. Climate alarmists have no idea what they're talking about. They've been wrong over and over and over again. Almost invariably, climate trends have gone the exact opposite of what they predicted. And there's a simple reason for that. Climate is cyclical. These people are ambulance chasers. During periods of time when the Earth is warming, they predict further warming. During periods of time when Earth is cooling, they predict further cooling. And they're always wrong. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. It's not an easy job committing fraud on the scale which climate alarmists are, so I thought I'd give them some assistance. I've developed some new software which will give them a boost in identifying which critical data they should be hiding. But first, there's some important news out of Washington, D.C. They've identified a panel of experts who will be setting our nation's climate policy. Apparently, the Democrats felt they needed people who were better educated than AOC or Greta. Now let's review the problem which my software will help climate alarmists solve. This is the main page from the part of the National Climate Assessment which went out to journalists and policymakers. This page contains a lot of graphics. Here's one which shows heat waves increasing since 1960. Here's another one which shows Arctic sea ice declining since 1979. And another one which shows wildfires increasing since 1983. And one more which shows sea level rising since 1920. So we have one graph which starts in 1960, another which starts in 1979, another which starts in 1920, and one more which starts in 1983. When you want to mislead people with statistics, picking your start date is very important. First, let's look at the heat wave graph, which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data, and you can see exactly what they did. The red bars are what policymakers saw, and the extreme heat prior to 1960 is what they didn't see. People may consider this sort of behavior to be shocking, but it's actually standard operating procedure for climate alarmists. This graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden from journalists and policymakers. This next graph is the one which shows wildfires increasing in the US since 1983. And this graph of US forest fires from the US Forest Service is the one which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. And you can see why they hid all the data before 1983, because there was a lot more burn acreage in the United States prior to 1983. Burn acreage in the US is down about 80% since the 1930s. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone because it was very hot and dry during the 1930s. Fires are associated with heat and droughts. There's very close correlation between heat waves and burn acreage. This next graphic overlays the graph which went out to journalists and policymakers over here on top of the data which didn't go out to journalists and policymakers. You can see the breathtaking fraud which is going on here. They carefully cherry-picked 1 year where they could show an increasing trend in wildfires, even though US wildfires are down 80%. And this graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden. Now let's look at the Arctic sea ice extent graph, which starts in 1979. Starting in 1979 makes it look like sea ice extent is decreasing linearly. And now let's look at the data which is being hidden. This graph is from the 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows Arctic sea ice extent all the way back to the early 1970s. And as you can see, extent was much lower prior to 1979. And 1979 was the peak. The data was taken from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here's the accompanying text from the 1990 IPCC report. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. And down here is the key sentence. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. So they hid the data before 1979 and tried to use the excuse that we didn't have satellite data prior to 1979. But the IPCC report said the exact opposite. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. This shouldn't surprise anyone because we went to the moon in 1969. We actually have satellite data from earlier than that. This is from the February 1965 issue of National Geographic. It's a satellite photo of Arctic sea ice looking down on the North Pole. It's pretty clear why the National Climate Assessment is hiding all the pre-1979 data, because it would wreck their linear downwards trend line. Here's one more graphic showing US sea level rising over the past century, as if sea level around the US could somehow be different than it is in the rest of the world. So now let's look at what they're hiding. Sea level has been rising at the same rate for thousands of years. This graph from NOAA is made from data from the tide gauge at Lower Manhattan. It shows that sea level has been rising at a steady rate since the middle of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln, 2.84 millimeters per year. Teddy Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Franklin Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Jimmy Carter, 2.84 millimeters per year. And during Donald Trump's first term, it's also 2.84 millimeters per year. In other words, there's no indication that humans have had any impact on the rate of sea level rise. And if we go back even further, we can see that sea level has actually been rising for about 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 meters or 400 feet lower than it is now. Anthropologists believe that during this time when sea level was very low, people were able to walk across from Siberia to North America, and that's how the first humans got here. From about 14,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very quickly, but since then it's been quite slow. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise is all natural, but somehow the last few inches were man-made. It's not easy work for climate alarmists to find the best point to start their phony graphs at, so I've developed some software to help them out. This graph shows the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at Waverly, Ohio for every year going back to 1895. You can see that there used to be a lot of 90-degree days at Waverly. Let me hover over this point. This is 1936. They had 82 90-degree days in 1936 at Waverly, Ohio. Now let's look at 1895. They had 73 days over 90 degrees in 1895. How about 1930? 1930 also had 73 days over 90 degrees. The year 1900 had 63 days over 90 degrees. So you can see that Waverly, Ohio had a lot of very hot summers prior to the year 1943, but since then summers have been much cooler there. And this diagonal downwards line shows the trend since the 1890s. The trend is about 26 fewer 90-degree days per century at Waverly, Ohio. My video this morning was about Iowa academics misrepresenting the trend in 90-degree days in Iowa. So the last thing which climate alarmists want the public to see is a downward trend in the number of hot days, which is actually occurring over most of the country. So in order to fool the public into believing that hot weather is increasing in the United States, they have to carefully cherry pick their start date. And my software will help them do that. Let me show you how. I'm going to drag the graph over to the left, and you're going to see the trend line change as I do. All right, here we go. I'm going to drag the graph, and you're going to see the trend line change dramatically. There we go. It's still going down, still going down, still going down. Whoa, now it's going up. That's exactly what climate alarmists want. So if you want to defraud the public about heat wave trends at Waverly, Ohio, the perfect start date is 1955. And the really cool thing is that with my software, you can do this with any kind of data, any kind of graph. Climate alarmists will be able to find the perfect cheating point for every single data set in the world. I'm open to suggestions what I should name this climate fraud tool, and I think I should charge them a lot of money for it. Going back to being serious, you might have noticed that I've been posting a lot of graphics recently. That's because the software enables me to find all kinds of interesting information which I wasn't aware of previously. I do intend to commercialize it at some point, but that's probably a few months off. So we can see that massive fraud is going on in climate science. Now let's look at some of the reasons why this is happening. Most climate scientists are just keeping their mouths closed because they have to. If they open their mouths, they'd lose their career, they'd lose their income, and they would be thoroughly trashed. But for some, it's the revolutionary mentality. This is an amazing email I got from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They said, achieving these greenhouse gas limits will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. This is about overthrowing our government, our freedom, and our way of life. It's more difficult to convince adults of their lies, so they've co-opted children who are very innocent and don't know any better. They had millions of school children out of school today as part of their mass propaganda campaign. The Green New Deal reads like the Communist Manifesto. In 2010, one of the leading officials of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, "We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. That has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." The New York Times wants people to panic because they know that panicked people are very easy to manipulate. And the Washington Post also wants people to panic, saying that the world's going to end in a little over 11 years. Same story is from the UN 30 years ago. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this is a scientific thing, not a political one. In 2013, President Obama tweeted that 97% of the world's scientists agree that we're in a climate crisis. That same year, the American Meteorological Society took a survey of their professional members. They were asked, is global warming happening? If so, what is its cause? Look at the results for the top row. Yes, mostly human. 52% of respondents agreed with that, and only 37% of professional forecasters. So just over 1/2 of all professional members of the American Meteorological Society agreed that global warming was mostly man-made, and just over 1/3 of professional forecasters. They were not asked if global warming was dangerous or if we're in a crisis. They probably would have been laughed at had they asked such a ridiculous question. What we're seeing is an attempt to overthrow our government and way of life by some very unscrupulous people. They are willing to lie, cheat, and abuse children in order to achieve their political goals. The key thing which all the sane people need to do is to force the EPA into doing a reevaluation of the CO2 endangerment finding. That is the legal document which will allow climate alarmists to destroy our way of life. Tell your politicians and everyone you know that they need to demand that the EPA CO2 endangerment finding is revisited. That is the critical thing in getting the scam stopped. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. A couple of professors at the University of Iowa just presented their climate prophecies. Senator Hogg from Iowa tweeted this morning. University of Iowa professors Peter Thorne and Jerry Schnorr urge Iowans to reduce fossil fuel pollution, prepare for more dangerous heat waves that threaten people and animals as they release latest Iowa scientist statement on climate change at Cedar Rapids Library. If you look at their poster, you'll see it says, Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year. That's pretty definitive, no uncertainty there. Here's a close-up, Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research. Iowa Climate Statement 2019. Dangerous heat events will be more frequent and severe. Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, if he thought science was certain, well, that was just an error on your part. I've studied Iowa climate quite a bit, and I know that the National Climate Assessment shows that peak temperatures in Iowa have plummeted over the last 60 years. This chart from the National Climate Assessment shows the change in warmest temperature of the year, 1986 to 2016 average, minus 1901 to 1960 average. Iowa is just about the fastest cooling place in the country. Peak temperatures there are down 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Peak temperatures are declining in most of the country, but particularly in the upper Midwest. This graph shows the average daily maximum temperature at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations for the past century. Maximum temperatures in Iowa have been declining steadily for the past century and are down nearly 2 degrees from 100 years ago. The hottest year in Iowa was 1931, where they had an average maximum temperature of 64 degrees. Recent years have been among the coolest on record. This next graph shows the average percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations. The frequency of 90-degree days in Iowa has dropped about 2/3 since the 1930s. So why are these professors saying Iowa will be hotter with more 90-degree days per year? There's no historical evidence to support that idea. I exchanged emails with one of them, and he told me they were aware of the fact that the frequency of 90-degree days had dropped in Iowa, and he said that they mentioned that in their press conference. He said the basis of their claims was climate models used in the National Climate Assessment. The climate models are written around the idea that increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere will produce more hot days. But the frequency of hot days in Iowa has plummeted as CO2 levels have increased. This graph shows the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit on the y-axis, and along the x-axis is increasing CO2 concentrations from left to right. Atmospheric CO2 has gone up from about 300 parts per million to over 400 parts per million over the last century. But as the amount of CO2 has increased in the atmosphere, the frequency of hot days in Iowa has dropped by more than 1/2. This shows us unequivocally that the climate models don't work. If they can't explain the past, they certainly aren't going to be able to predict the future. There's no reason to believe that this trend will not continue on the same path that's been going on over the past century. This next graph shows the peak temperatures in Iowa for every year going back to 1893. You can see that peak temperatures in Iowa have dropped sharply over the last 120 years, and particularly over the last 80 years. Temperatures over 110 degrees were quite common in Iowa prior to 1940, and in 1936 they reached an incredible 117 degrees. But now Iowa rarely gets above even 100 degrees. This graph shows the number of 100-degree days recorded in Iowa for every year going back to 1893. As you can see, prior to 60 years ago, 100-degree days were much more common, but they're very rare now. During 1913, 1934, and 1936, Iowa recorded more than 40 days over 100 degrees. But now Iowa typically records either 0 or 1 day above 100 degrees per year. This graph is a little different. It shows the number of 100-degree temperature readings recorded at all Iowa United States Historical Climatology Network stations for every year. So say you had 10 stations recording on the same day temperatures over 100 degrees, they'd all get counted. During the record hot summer of 1936, more than 500 100-degree temperature readings were recorded in Iowa. The worst heat wave on record in Iowa occurred at Logan from June 16, 1936 to September 6, 1936. The average temperature at Logan during that almost 3-month period was an incredible 98 degrees. To put that in perspective, the hottest temperature in Logan this summer was 96 degrees. So the hottest temperature this year was lower than the average during 1936. That's an amazing statistic which shows just how much Iowa's cooled down over the last 80 years. Here's some headlines from Iowa papers during the summer of 1936. Des Moines Register, 35 die in Iowa, mercury at 115 degrees. The Daily Times, Wednesday, July 8, 1936. Pleasant Valley onion harvest opens amid record heat. Field workers swelter in temperature of 120 degrees. Drought curtails crop 20% and speeds maturity. Cedar Rapids Gazette, city gasps in record heat. Expected hot weather relief fails to reach Iowa. 113 degrees today, highest in 22 years of records. Now let's look at the professors who are making these prophecies. Peter S. Thorne, Department, Occupational and Environmental Health. Well, that doesn't sound like climate science. Gerald L. Schnorr, Professor, Civil and Environmental Engineering. That doesn't sound like climate science either. And then Peter Thorne, communicating the best available science. These two men are not communicating science at all. They're simply telling prophecies. Prophecies made from climate models which show zero skill and in fact predict the exact opposite of what's been occurring. What the data shows is that the frequency of 90-degree days in Iowa has plummeted over the last century. It's down about 2/3. There's no reason to believe that they will increase in the future. Their entire prediction was based on climate models which don't work. Climate models would have predicted an increase in the number of 90-degree days as CO2 increased over the last century, but the opposite has occurred, so the climate models are broken and worthless. The same group of Iowa ambulance chasers has been at it for a long time. Here's an article about the same group from 2012. Iowa scientists, drought a sign of climate change. Associated Press, November 20th, 2012. Des Moines, Iowa. This year's drought is consistent with predictions that global climate change will bring about weather extremes, including more frequent droughts, at a report released Monday. The Iowa Climate Statement updates the 2010 report, reflecting the year's lingering drought and the belief that it signifies what many scientists have predicted. Increasing instability in weather patterns will lead to extremes during both wet and dry years. Now let's look at the actual drought history for Iowa from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is the Palmer Drought Severity Index for Iowa. Green means wetter, brown means drier. It means drought. That prediction was made during the drought of 2012. But as you can see, drought has become less common in Iowa, not more common. Like in the 1930s, Iowa was in drought most of the time, similar in the 1950s. But in recent years, they've been having much less drought than Iowa used to have. And the other thing to notice is that weather patterns have always been very unstable, alternating rapidly between wet periods and dry periods. They used to happen more frequently than they do now. The climate has actually become more stable in Iowa. I don't see any indication that this group of Iowa academics has any predictive skill. They seem to be just ambulance chasers playing on people's fears. This group is trying to influence policy with unsupportable junk science. This is exactly what President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell speech 60 years ago, back in the days when Iowa actually was really hot. The president said, "In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite." That's what these professors are attempting to do with their fear-mongering. They got the senators' attention. When people declare unsupportable certainty in science, all they're doing is destroying the reputation and integrity of science. How is the public going to feel about science when none of these prophecies of doom come to pass? And there's no reason to believe that Iowans have control either over the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or the climate. China is building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants, one every 2 weeks. Iowa could drop off the map entirely and it wouldn't make a significant difference to the global CO2 budget. I come from a science and engineering world where everything has to be perfect or people will die. But academics have a different perspective. They seem to feel like they can just make things up and get away with it. Climate models are not reality. Their forecasts for Iowa go against the trend. They show zero skill at predicting Iowa's past and certainly won't be able to predict Iowa's future. The fact that other academics make the same mistake of conflating climate models with reality doesn't make the mistake any less egregious. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Michael Mann claimed that he won the Nobel Prize, but he didn't. His Nobel Prize was just as fake as his science. This is the lawsuit which he filed against Mark Stein. This claim was in the lawsuit. Dr. Mann is a climate scientist whose research has focused on global warming. Along with other researchers, he was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century and the steep increase in measured temperatures since the 1950s. As a result of this research, Dr. Mann and his colleagues were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And here was Michael Mann's Nobel Prize in his office window. But the director of the Nobel Institute had a completely different story. 1, Michael Mann has never been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 2, he did not receive any personal certificate. He has taken the diploma awarded in 2007 to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and to Al Gore and made his own text underneath this authentic-looking diploma. 3, the text underneath the diploma is entirely his own. We issued only the diploma to the IPCC as such. No individuals on the IPCC side received anything in 2007. Very few people attempt to fraudulently claim in a court of law that they won the Nobel Peace Prize, but Michael Mann is an exception. Now let's look at the other part of his claim. He was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. And there's his hockey stick. He showed temperatures slowly cooling for nearly 1,000 years until CO2 levels hit 301 parts per million, and then all heck broke loose. Apparently that last part per million going from 300 parts per million up to 301 parts per million was the tipping point. That set off a catastrophic rise in temperatures. Michael Mann's hockey stick looked very different from what the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed in 1974. They showed the world getting much cooler after the 1940s. and that in fact 1970 was cooler than 1870. July 21st, 1974, Des Moines Sunday Register. World is getting cooler. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people consider these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead, climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with an unusually mild weather and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world as a whole has dropped by 1/3 to 1/2 degree centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperatures since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert H. Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Britain. Global cooling may be the cause of the devastating African drought, now in its 6th year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rain belt southward, causing many of the life-giving rains to fall on already fertile lands or into the sea. Dry weather conditions also prevail in parts of India, China, Kenya, Bolivia, and other countries on both sides of the equator, raising the specter of even more serious drought and famine. Drought has hit the United States regularly about every 20 years and is due again in the mid-1970s. So in 1974, droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes were blamed on global cooling, the same things which climate scientists now blame on global warming. Now compare what that article said to what Michael Mann is saying now. He was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research and many other scientists said the exact opposite of what Mann was claiming. They showed a very sharp decline in temperatures after the 1940s, such that 1970 was cooler than 1870. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences showed the same thing. They showed a sharp cooling after the 1940s, a cooling which Michael Mann has erased. Michael Mann turned this large amount of cooling after the 1940s back to below 1870 levels into a little tiny cooling blip. In 1961, the New York Times reported that there was a unanimous consensus among scientists that Earth was cooling. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It is getting colder. National Geographic published this article in 1976. And just what is going on with the climate? What changes are taking place around us? From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. I heard from a tall, quiet-spoken Dr. J. Murray Mitchell, Jr. of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He's one of the nation's most respected climatologists. He went on, but since about 1940, there has been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, even more on high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first, but more sharply over the last decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed the recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. Let's look at this sentence again. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. Well, ice doesn't lie, but Michael Mann does. Obviously, the world was getting cooler. This was the cover of Science News on March 1st, 1975. The Ice Age cometh, glaciers plowing through Manhattan. The cover of the Chicago Tribune on the following day. Brr, new Ice Age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place. a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. And here's The Guardian, January 29th, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. New York Times, December 29th, 1974. A number of climatologists whose job it is to keep an eye on long-term weather changes have lately been predicting deterioration of the benign climate to which we have grown accustomed. They point to signs both great, a steady global cooling trend since World War II, and quaint, the southward retreat from Nebraska of the warmth-loving armadillo, to support their claim that the coming years will feature colder, more erratic weather. Some recent warnings from reputable researchers in Japan, Europe, and the US have so worried policymakers that last January, certain scientists at a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences proposed the evacuation of some 6 million people from their parched homelands in the Sahel region of Africa. So scientists wanted to rescue 6 million people from global cooling, and they also wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap to stop the cooling trend. Newsweek, April 28, 1975. Science, the cooling world. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than those they solve. Why didn't we listen to the scientists and melt the Arctic 45 years ago? New York Times, January 5th, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in the Northern Hemisphere. Here's a letter which 42 top scientists wrote to President Nixon in 1972. Dear Mr. President, aware of your deep concern with the future of the world, we feel obliged to inform you on the results of the scientific conference held here recently at Brown University. The conference dealt with the past and future changes of climate and was attended by 42 top American and European investigators. We enclosed the summary report published in Science, and further publications are forthcoming in quaternary research. The main conclusion of the meeting was that a global deterioration of the climate, by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind, is a very real possibility, and indeed may be due very soon. The cooling has a natural cause and falls within the rank of processes which produced the last ice age. Then I'll skip down here. The present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century, if continuing at the present pace. But wait a minute, Michael Mann said there was a steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. He couldn't have lied about that, could he? So we have pretty good indication that the blade of Mann's hockey stick is fraudulent. What about the left side of the graph? This was the global temperature graph from the 1990 IPCC report made just a few years prior to Mann's hockey stick. It showed something completely different. The 1990 graph looked nothing like a hockey stick. It showed the period around 1200 AD is much warmer than the present, and there was no blade. There was a very strong medieval warm period and a very strong little ice age. There's huge amounts of evidence that there was a medieval warm period and that there was a little ice age, and that Michael Mann is committing fraud. I don't want to get into a great amount of detail about that right now, but let's look at one piece of evidence: the history of glaciers in Glacier National Park from the USGS. The history of glaciation within current Glacier National Park boundaries spans centuries of glacial growth and recession, carving the features we see today. Glaciers were present within current Glacier National Park boundaries as early as 7,000 years ago, but may have survived an early Holocene warm period, making them much older. These modest glaciers varied in size, tracking climatic changes, but did not grow to their Holocene maximum size until the end of the Little Ice Age, around AD 1850. While they may not have formed in their entirety during the Little Ice Age, their maximum perimeters can be documented through mapping of lateral and terminal moraines. The extent and mass of these glaciers, as well as glaciers around the globe, has clearly decreased during the 20th century in response to warmer temperatures. This is the key sentence. These modest glaciers varied in size, tracking climatic changes, but did not grow to their Holocene maximum size until the end of the Little Ice Age, around AD 1850. Now look closely at this sentence. While they may not have formed in their entirety during the Little Ice Age. What they're telling us is that the glaciers grew rapidly during the Little Ice Age and may not have existed at all prior to the Little Ice Age, which would have been the medieval warm period. Now let's compare this description to the 1990 IPCC graph. Glaciers were smaller, non-existent during the medieval warm period, and they formed during the Little Ice Age. It makes perfect sense. But the behavior of the ice makes no sense in the context of man's hockey stick, because there was no Little Ice Age and there was no medieval warm period. Ice doesn't lie, but Michael Mann does. But here's the punchline. In 2006, Dr. David Deming of the University of Oklahoma testified to the Senate that he was told that scientists wanted to get rid of the medieval warm period. He said, I had another interesting experience around the time my paper in Science was published, 1995. I received an astonishing email from a major researcher in the area of climate change. He said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. And they found just the guy to do their dirty work for him, Michael Mann, the fake Nobel Prize guy. But there's something else incredible about the hockey stick, which I alluded to briefly at the beginning of the video. Mann's hockey stick shows steady, slow global cooling until the atmosphere reached 301 parts per million CO2. And then all heck broke loose. Temperatures started skyrocketing upwards really fast. So 301 parts per million CO2 must be the tipping point. The implication being that in order to stop global warming, we would have to go all the way back to pre-industrial levels of CO2. If we believe his graph, then any time carbon dioxide is above 301 parts per million, temperatures are going to skyrocket. No more cars or airplanes or lights or yacht rides for Greta or trips to the UN or trips to the US Congress. We'd have to go back to a really primitive state of living. George Orwell said, so much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot. Climate alarmists have no idea how dangerous their games and their lies are. Their lifestyle and livelihood is completely dependent on having responsible politicians who don't listen to them. But now there's a lot of politicians who seem to want to act on this madness. They want to take us back to pre-industrial levels of CO2. These people need to be stopped. And Michael Mann needs to be exposed for the fraud that he is. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. There are a lot of organizations currently committing climate fraud in exchange for money, and the Union of Concerned Scientists is one of the worst. Their name makes them sound so sincere and intelligent. They're scientists, and they're concerned. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, we live in an unscientific age in which almost all the buffeting of communications and television, words, books, and so on are unscientific. As a result, there is considerable amounts of intellectual tyranny in the name of science. Now let's look at the Union of Concerned Scientists' latest fraud. They're doing what all climate alarmists seem to be doing these days, trying to create fear, particularly fear among children, fear that they're going to burn up. The Union of Concerned Scientists, Science for a Healthy Planet and Safer World, July 22nd, 2019. UCS Extreme Heat Report, a call to action on Midwest clean energy. Excessively hot weather spread across the Great Plains and Midwest states last week. On Friday, Chicago faced heat indexes well above 110 degrees, and many other areas endured dangerous heat warnings and advisories. According to a sobering new report issued earlier this week by the Union of Concerned Scientists, the heat impacts of climate change will bring increasingly frequent extreme heat events such as these if we don't take aggressive action to mitigate global warming pollution. The report, Killer Heat in the United States, Climate Choices in the Future of Dangerously Hot Days, is scary news, but it's also a call to action. Clean energy is moving forward in the Midwest, and that's a good thing. By pursuing rapid emissions reductions, we can work to lessen the brunt of extreme heat we'll face in the years to come. What are the projected heat impacts in the Midwest? Here's some findings from the Killer Heat Report, focusing in on our region, assuming no action to limit global heat-trapping emissions. The U.S. Midwest region, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, and Wisconsin, which has historically seen an average of 6 days with a heat index over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, is projected to see an average of 53 days per year with a heat index over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The region will also see 38 days per year with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit and 7 off-the-charts days per year by the end of the century. For Illinois specifically, there have historically been 34 days per year on average with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This would increase to 80 days per year on average by mid-century and 107 days by century's end. The state has historically had 7 days per year on average with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but this would increase to 43 days per year on average by mid-century and 69 by the century's end. The amount of fraud in this article is absolutely off scale, one of the worst I've ever seen. Their historical information is fraudulent and their projections are fraudulent, and they make them with such great authority. This is the kind of unscientific tyranny which Feynman was talking about. They call themselves the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then they rattle off a series of numbers which they simply pulled out from where the sun never shines. The message they're trying to send out here is that Midwesterners can somehow save themselves from this extreme heat in the future if they get rid of their cars and their fossil fuels and build windmills. This is complete nonsense. China and India are building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. The Midwest and the United States could drop off the face of the earth, and CO2 levels in the atmosphere will continue to rise exponentially. Now let's look at the numbers. This is the actual number of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit reported at all Midwest U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations every year going back to 1895. I've separated it into two groups. The past 65 years are in blue, and more than 65 years ago is in red. As you can see, there's been a sharp drop-off in the number of 100-degree days in the Midwest over the past 65 years, and recent years have had almost none. Over the past 65 years, the Midwest has averaged about 16 days per year in which at least one station reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But from 1895 to 1954, the average was 36 days per year, so it's down more than 50% over the last 65 years. The article discussed Illinois specifically, so here's the same graph for Illinois. Over the past 65 years, Illinois has been averaging about 7 days per year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but prior to 65 years ago, they averaged about 17 days per year. So the number of 100-degree days in Illinois is down more than 50%, and in the last few years, they've had almost no 100-degree days. This graph is slightly different. It's the number of 100-degree readings at all Illinois stations for every year going back to 1895. So if 10 stations reported temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit on one day, they would all get counted in the total. As you can see in this graph, the frequency of 100-degree days in Illinois has plummeted over the last 65 years. Prior to 65 years ago, there used to be a lot more 100-degree days, particularly during the 1930s. This next graph shows the highest recorded temperature in Illinois for every year going back to 1895. Once again, you can see that Illinois was a lot hotter prior to 65 years ago. The hottest temperatures in Illinois are down more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1930s. That's a huge drop in temperature. And my graph correlates very closely with this map from the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment is mainstream climate science, and it shows a huge drop in peak temperatures in Illinois. So the Union of Concerned Scientists is simply lying. They're out of the mainstream. They have no idea what they're talking about. And this graph from the National Climate Assessment shows the same thing for the entire country. There's been a huge drop in the peak temperatures for the entire U.S. over the past 80 years. Now let's look at the average daily maximum temperature in the Midwest for every year going back to 1895. As you can see, there's been a huge drop in temperature, particularly over the last 80 years, with recent years being among the coolest on record in the Midwest. And the data I used to generate this graph is the official temperature record from the United States for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's the average of all daily maximum temperature records at all Midwest stations. It's a simple average, it's very simple mathematics, and I've released all of my software which I use to generate this graph. It's available for anyone to check out. This next graph is the average mean daily temperature at all Midwest stations. That's the average of the maximum, the minimum every day. You can see that mean temperatures are also down, particularly over the last 80 years. Now I'm going to show a series of graphs showing the frequency of warm and hot days at all Midwest stations going back to the beginning of the 20th century. As you can see, the percent of days above 80 degrees Fahrenheit has plummeted over the last century. Even worse for 85 degrees. 85-degree days are sharply down in the Midwest. 90-degree days are down even more in the Midwest. 90-degree days are much less common now than they were 100 years ago. 95-degree days are sharply down, and 100-degree days are sharply down too. The Midwest used to be a lot hotter, and it's gotten much cooler, with recent years being among the coolest on record. This next graph shows the date of the average first day over 80 degrees Fahrenheit at all Midwest stations. As you can see, the first warm day is coming later than it used to. And this graph shows the average last day over 80 degrees Fahrenheit at all Midwest stations. As you can see, the summer is ending much earlier than it used to. So summer is starting later and it's ending earlier. Summers in the Midwest are getting shorter. This next graph is the one which really exposes the Union of Concerned Scientists fraud. On the y-axis is the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the x-axis is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increasing from left to right. This graph shows something amazing. As carbon dioxide has increased, the frequency of hot days in the Midwest has plummeted. The Union of Concerned Scientists is trying to tell people that if they give up their cars, their lifestyle, and their reliable fuel supply, they can save themselves from hot weather in the future. When in fact, as greenhouse gases have increased, the frequency of hot days has plummeted. Everything the Union of Concerned Scientists is saying is completely fraudulent. The worst heat wave in Illinois and the Midwest occurred in 1936. During that year, Harrisburg, Illinois had 46 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's shown by the purple line here. The other colored dots are temperatures at all the other Illinois stations on the same dates. Illinois reached an unbelievable 114 degrees on July 14, 1936. In 1936, Illinois had almost 1,000 100-degree temperature readings. But since the year 2013, Illinois has had none. The depths of dishonesty by the so-called Union of Concerned Scientists is simply stunning. Now we're looking at an animation of every Illinois station which had at least 30 100-degree days per year. Let's look at the years when this occurred. 1954, 1936, 1936, 1901, 1936, 1936, 1936, 1913, 1936, 1930, 1936, 1934, 1913, 1936, 1901, 1936, 1934, 1936, 1934, 1930, 1936, 1936, 1936, 1954. No station in Illinois has recorded 30 or more 100-degree days in the last 65 years. 1901 was one of the heat wave years we were just looking at. Let's look at the New York Times headlines every day from June 29th through July 4th, 1901. June 29, 1901, heat brings death and much suffering. June 30th, 1901, New York wilts in protracted heat. July 1st, 1901, the city of Furnace, virtually deserted. July 2nd, 1901, heat's holocaust in the 5 boroughs, 87 deaths and 178 prostrations. July 3rd, 1901, Heat brings death to over 200 persons. July 4th, 1901, 200 more dead. Logan, Iowa had 19 consecutive days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in 1901, and they got up to a peak of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The Union of Concerned Scientists wants people to believe that if they build windmills, they won't have hot weather. This is complete nonsense. Now let's look at another July 4th heat wave. July 4th, 1911 was the hottest July 4th on record in the United States. Tuesday, July 4th, 1911, nation in throes of heat tide, temperature records broken at all points, suicides, deaths, and prostrations reported in many cities. Thermometers burst. Here's the New York Times from July 4th, 1911. Crazed by heat, kills himself. Heat kills over 100 in country. Claims 10 victims in New York where the mercury goes up to 98. Many drop in street. The 1911 heat wave killed thousands of people in New England, but it was even worse in Europe. More than 40,000 people died in France during the 1911 heat wave. Now let's look at 1936, which was the most intense heat wave on record in the United States. This is an animation showing temperatures from July 7th to July 14th, 1936. Pink dots represent temperatures over 100 degrees. Red dots represent temperatures over 90 degrees. You can see the mind-blowing heat which was occurring all over, particularly the eastern half of the United States. Completely unprecedented. We never see anything like that anymore. Here's some headlines from 1936. Heat wave toll over 12,000 in 86 cities this week. Crop crisis worse. Heat rising to 119 degrees. 31 cities are over 100 degrees. Illinois highways blow up. July 16, 1936. Worst drought in history. Millions hit in America. Nation counts nearly 4,200 dead. But that wasn't the only thing going on in 1936. March 1936 brought